The courtroom is quiet. It is a February morning in 1986 in Palermo, Sicily, but this is not a normal courtroom. This is a bunker, a special fortress built under the Ucciardone prison. It has walls made of steel and concrete, glass partitions that stop bullets, and armed guards at every door. The biggest mafia trial ever is about to start. Everyone knows that speaking against Cosa Nostra means you will be killed. 475 defendants sit in rows of metal cages. These are not ordinary criminals. These are the most powerful men in Sicily. Men who have ruled through violence and silence for generations. Men who have never been caught by the law because the law has always been too scared. Then a man walks to the witness stand. He is 57 years old. He is thin with gray hair and sharp eyes. He wears a simple suit. His hands do not shake. His voice is calm and steady when he speaks. He looks directly at the men in the cages. Men he has known for decades. Men he has worked with. Men he has called friends and brothers. His name is Tommaso Buscetta. He is about to do something no one has ever done before. He is about to break Omertà. That is the sacred rule of silence that has protected the mafia for over 100 years. He is about to give names. He is about to share secrets. He is about to show how an organization that has always stayed in the shadows and whispers is set up. He is about to turn against everything he once promised to protect. The men in the cages stare at him with hate. Some make gestures of cutting their throats. Others just shake their heads, unable to believe it. How could he do this? How could a man of honor become an infame? That means a man without honor. But Tommaso Buscetta does not look away. For him, this is not betrayal. This is payback. This is fairness. This is the only weapon left for a man who has lost everything. When this trial ends, 360 defendants will be found guilty. Prison sentences adding up to 2,665 years will be given. The Sicilian Mafia will take a hit that will need decades to recover from. And it will all happen because one man chose to speak. But how did we get here? To understand the man who broke the silence, we must go back to the start. We must travel to a hot July day in 1928, to the narrow streets of Palermo, to a world of poverty, honor, and blood. We must know the boy before we can understand the man. Before we start this amazing true story, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Are you getting comfortable for the night? Or are you listening during a quiet afternoon? There is something about these deep historical stories that works best in the quiet hours. That is when we can really lose ourselves in another time and place. If you enjoy deep looks into real history and true crime, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Share it with someone who likes a good story. Someone who knows that the most interesting tales are often the ones that really happened. Welcome. Now, let us start the story of Tommaso Buscetta, the man of honor who would change everything. This is a journey that will take us from the ruins of post-war Sicily to the beaches of Brazil, from the streets of Brooklyn to a courtroom bunker in Palermo. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of family and revenge, of a code of honor that would end up destroying itself. Get comfortable. This will take some time. But I promise you, it is worth it, Palermo. July 13th, 1928. The city was hot under the Sicilian sun. Its narrow streets were like a maze of poverty and pride. In the Porta Nuova neighborhood, one of the poorest parts of a poor city, a child was born to a family that had nothing except their name and their hunger. They named him Tommaso after his grandfather. From his very first breath, he breathed in the mix of desperation and defiance that defined Sicily under fascist rule. The Buscetta family lived in a street-level basso. That was a single room that opened right onto the street. Privacy was a luxury they could not afford. Just like food, Tommaso's father, Antonio, worked when he could find work. That was not often. His mother, Maria, worked a daily miracle feeding 6 children on almost no money. The walls of their home were stained with dampness. The floor was bare stone. In winter, the cold came up through that stone like the hands of the dead reaching up from below. But poverty in Sicily was not like poverty in other places. It came with a strange dignity, a feeling that being poor was not your fault. It was like being born with dark hair or brown eyes. The poor of Palermo were proud, very proud. They taught their children that even if they did not have bread, they would always have honor. Young Tommaso learned this lesson early. He learned it from the way his mother held her head high when the landlord came asking for rent she could not pay. He learned it from the way his father refused to beg, even when the family went hungry. And he learned it in the streets. There, boys fought with broken bottles and rocks. Not over money. None of them had money. They fought over respect, over being seen in a world that seemed to want to pretend they did not exist. The Porta Nuova neighborhood was its own world, a place where the Italian government's power was more like an idea than a fact. The police came through sometimes. They always came in groups and always looked nervous. They took their bribes and left quickly. The real power in places like Porta Nuova came from somewhere else, from the men of honor, the mafiosi. They settled arguments. They offered protection. They kept a rough kind of order in a place where chaos was always just one hungry day away. Tommaso watched these men with the same intensity that hungry boys have for food and desperate boys have for hope. They were different from the other men in the neighborhood. They dressed better, not rich, but clean and neat. They walked differently, with confidence, with purpose. When they talked, people listened. When they gave orders, people obeyed. And most important, they were never hungry. In a neighborhood where hunger was as common as breathing, these men always ate. The 1930s in Sicily were years of terrible poverty. It was made worse by Mussolini's fascist government. Il Duce had declared war on the mafia in the 1920s. He sent a ruthless official named Cesare Mori to Sicily with orders to crush the organization by any means necessary. Mori had succeeded in a way. He had arrested thousands. He had forced confessions through torture. He had filled prisons with suspected mafiosi. But in doing this, he had also taught an entire generation that power belonged to those who were willing to use violence, and that the law was just another kind of force. You either respected it or found a way around it, depending on the situation. By the time Tommaso was old enough to understand such things, the official mafia had been forced underground or into exile, but the mindset, the culture, the understanding of how the world really worked, these things stayed. They were woven into the very stones of Palermo's streets. Tommaso went to school sometimes. That was true for most children in Porta Nuova. School was a luxury when there were errands to run, money to earn, and stomachs to fill. He learned to read and write enough to get by. But his real education happened in the streets. He learned which shops would let you pay later and which demanded cash now. He learned which adults could be trusted and which would turn on you for a handful of lira. He learned how to be invisible when the police came through. And he learned how to be noticed when there was a chance to get ahead. In 1943, when Tommaso was 15, the world came to Sicily. The Allied invasion, called Operation Husky, turned the island into a battlefield. American and British troops landed on the southern beaches and fought their way north toward Palermo. The war that had seemed far away suddenly became terrifyingly real. Bombs fell from the sky. Buildings turned into piles of rubble. People died in numbers that made ordinary deaths seem small. But war, like poverty, created chances for those willing to take them. The black market exploded. Everything was for sale: food, medicine, gas, weapons, information. The Americans needed guides, translators, and local people who knew the area and could work through the complicated web of loyalties and grudges that defined Sicilian society. And who was better to serve as these go-betweens than the mafiosi? The men who had been treated as criminals by the fascists now presented themselves as anti-fascist allies of the liberators. Tommaso, smart from the streets and hungry, found work running errands for the men who ran the black market. He delivered messages, he carried packages, he served as a lookout. He asked no questions and kept his mouth shut. In return, he ate. For a boy who had known hunger his whole life, this was payment enough, but he learned something else too. Something that would shape the rest of his life. He learned that the men who made money from the war, the men who dealt with the Americans and ran the black market, were the same men who had commanded respect in Porto Novo before the war. The government had changed. The language on official papers had changed. The uniforms had changed. But real power stayed with those who knew that force. Fear and favors were the true currencies of the world. By the time the war ended in 1945, Tommaso Buscetta was 17 years old. He had lived through poverty, fascism, and war. He had learned the lessons that the streets teach to those who live long enough to learn them, and he had made his decision about what kind of man he would be. He would be a man of honor, a mafioso, one of those who gave orders instead of taking them, who ate instead of going hungry, who shaped events instead of being shaped by them. The path ahead would be soaked in blood, his own and others. But in post-war Palermo, where the dead still lay in the rubble, and the future seemed as uncertain as the next meal, Tommaso Buscetta took his first steps toward becoming one of the most powerful and finally one of the most significant criminals in history. The end of the war did not bring peace to Sicily. It only brought a different kind of disorder. The fascists were gone. They had been replaced by a democratic government in Rome that was far away and distracted. The Americans, after freeing the island, moved on to other concerns. Into the space they left behind flowed the same old power, wearing a slightly different face, Cosa Nostra, our thing, as its members called it. It rebuilt itself with amazing speed. The men who had been locked up by Mori were released or came back from exile. The Americans, eager to set up anti-communist governments in Italy, had worked with mafiosi during the invasion and occupation. This made them look like respected members of the community. The Christian Democratic Party, desperate for votes and local support, made quiet deals with the men of honor. They let them go back to their traditional roles as go-betweens and power brokers. In exchange, the mafiosi delivered votes. Tommaso watched all of this with the careful eye of someone who understood that history was not something that just happened to you. It was something you made happen if you were bold enough. He was 19 years old. He was lean and had dark, sharp eyes. He had a charisma that drew people to him and an intelligence that kept him alive. In the years right after the war, he did what young men in his neighborhood did: small crimes, petty theft, black market deals that brought in enough to live on, but not enough to get ahead. But he wanted more. He wanted to be like the men he had admired as a child, the men who commanded respect, who walked with confidence, who never went hungry. So he sought them out. He made himself useful. He showed that he could be trusted with tasks that grew more important over time. His entry into the criminal world followed a pattern as old as the Mafia itself. First came the small jobs, delivering messages, collecting debts, serving as muscle for operations that needed intimidation more than actual violence. He learned the layout of power in Palermo. He learned which families controlled which neighborhoods. He learned the complicated web of alliances and grudges that decided who could do business where. Palermo in the late 1940s was split among several mafia families. Each controlled its own area and its own rackets within a complex system of mutual respect and constant tension. There was the Santa Maria di Gesù family, the Portanova family, the Passo di Rigano family. Each had its own boss, its own soldiers, its own area of influence. Above them all sat the commission, the Kupala. This was a council of bosses who settled arguments and made decisions about things that affected all of Cosa Nostra. Tommaso joined the Portanova family. That was the organization that controlled his home neighborhood. His sponsor was a man named Don Paolino. He was a traditionalist who believed in the old codes. He taught that a man of honor should protect the weak, not hurt them. He insisted that certain lines should never be crossed. No dealing in prostitution, no kidnapping for ransom, no getting involved in politics that would draw unwanted attention from the state. Under Don Paolino's guidance, Tommaso learned the real rules of Cosa Nostra, the unwritten codes that separated a man of honor from a common criminal. He learned about Omertà. That was the absolute rule of silence that banned any cooperation with authorities. No matter what the situation, he learned about respect. That was the currency that mattered more than money. It decided your place in the group. He learned about family, not just your blood relatives, but the family of Cosa Nostra. In theory, it came before everything else, even your own blood. In 1949, when he was 21 years old, Tommaso Buscetta was formally brought into Cosa Nostra. The ceremony happened in a private room, with members of the Portanova family there as witnesses. It was a ritual that had not changed for generations. It was designed to bind a man to the organization through symbols and promises. They formed a circle. Don Paolino stood in the center. He held a knife and a gun. He pricked Tommaso's finger with the knife. A drop of blood fell onto a holy card with a picture of a saint. Then he set the card on fire. As it burned, Tommaso held it. He let the flames touch his fingers. It burned his skin. It tested his ability to handle pain without flinching. "This is how we enter Cosa Nostra," Don Paolino said in a deep voice. "With blood and fire as this card burns. May your flesh burn if you betray us, as this blood falls. May your blood be spilled if you break your oath." Tommaso spoke the words of the oath, the same words that thousands of men before him had said. "I swear to be faithful to Cosa Nostra. If I betray, may my flesh burn like this saint." And then it was done. He was no longer Tommaso Buscetta. Poor boy from Portanova, he was Tommaso Buscetta, man of honor, member of Cosa Nostra, bound by a sacred oath that came before all other duties. To his family, to the state, to the church, to anyone or anything outside the organization. His early years as a made man were spent in the cigarette smuggling trade. This was one of the most profitable and least dangerous rackets around. Post-war Italy had high taxes on tobacco that created a huge black market for smuggled cigarettes. The illegal goods came from Switzerland, from North Africa, from anywhere taxes were lower or did not exist. It was spread through networks controlled by the Mafia. Tommaso was good at the work. He was smart enough to keep accurate records. He was tough enough to make sure people paid what they owed. He was diplomatic enough to smooth over arguments before they turned into violence. He made money, good money, and he began to build a reputation as someone who could be trusted with responsibility. But more than that, he began to build connections outside Sicily. The cigarette smuggling business needed coordination with suppliers in other countries, with distributors in mainland Italy, with corrupt officials who needed to be paid to look the other way. Tommaso learned that the mafia's power went far beyond Palermo's narrow streets. There were men of honor in Marsala, in Catania, in New York. Cosa Nostra was not just a Sicilian thing. It was an international network that crossed borders and languages. In 1955, when he was 27 years old, Tommaso married his first wife, Melchiora Cavallaro. She was a respectable woman from a good family. They would have 4 children together: Benedetto, Antonio, Felicia, and Teresa. He bought a small house in a decent neighborhood. Not Porta Nuova, but not far from it. He tried to keep up the idea that he was a regular businessman, that the money he brought home came from honest work. But even as he played the role of family man, Tommaso was being pulled deeper into the world of serious crime. The 1950s were good years for Cosa Nostra. The Italian economy was recovering from the war. That created new chances for extortion, corruption, and illegal business. The construction industry became a gold mine for the mafia. Government contracts went to companies that were controlled by or paid tribute to men of honor. Tommaso was part of all of it. He collected protection money from shopkeepers. He put mafia money into legal businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. He settled arguments. He ordered beatings. And when necessary, he approved killings. He was making his mark. He was showing that he had what it took for this life. But he was also building a reputation for being smart, for thinking ahead instead of just reacting, for understanding that violence should be used carefully, not as a first choice. Other men might shoot first and think later. Tommaso preferred to negotiate, to find solutions that did not leave bodies in the street and police asking questions. This approach earned him respect from the older generation of mafiosi, the traditionalists who believed that the mafia should be a secret group, operating in the shadows instead of drawing attention. They saw in him a successor, someone who understood the old codes even as the world changed around them. But the world was changing faster than anyone realized. New opportunities were appearing. Opportunities that would make cigarette smuggling look like child's play. And Tommaso Buscetta, ambitious and intelligent, was putting himself in position to take advantage of those opportunities. The stage was being set for the change of Cosa Nostra from a regional criminal group into a worldwide empire. And Tommaso, still young, still learning, still believing in the codes he had sworn to follow, was about to become one of the main builders of that change. In 1956, Tommaso Buscetta left Sicily for the first time. He traveled to the United States on what was officially a tourist visa, but really, he was on a mission to make the ties stronger between Cosa Nostra in Sicily and the American mafia families. Those families had grown powerful during Prohibition and the boom after the war. New York City must have seemed like another planet to a man from Palermo. The size of everything, the buildings that touched the sky, the wealth shown in shop windows, the huge number of people packed onto streets wider than any in Sicily. All of it confirmed what Tommaso had already begun to understand. America was where the real money was, where the real power was. He was introduced to members of the Bonanno crime family. This was one of New York's 5 families, and the one with the strongest ties to Sicily. The Bonannos were led by Joseph Bonanno, known as Joe Bananas. He was a Sicilian-born boss who kept close connections with the island of his birth. Bonanno understood something that many American mobsters did not. The future of organized crime was not in traditional rackets like gambling and loan sharking. It was in drugs, specifically heroin. The math for heroin was simple and compelling. A kilogram of morphine base could be bought in Turkey for a few $1,000s. When it was refined into heroin in labs in Sicily or France, that same kilogram was worth 10 times as much. When it was smuggled into the United States and sold on the streets, it could be cut and mixed until it generated 100 times its original cost. The profits made cigarette smuggling look like selling newspapers. But there were problems. The American Mafia families had usually stayed away from drugs. The punishments were harsh. The attention from law enforcement was intense. Many older bosses worried that dealing drugs would destroy the organization. It could tempt members to betray each other to avoid long prison sentences. The Sicilian Mafia did not have those concerns. They saw heroin as just another product, no different in principle from cigarettes or stolen goods. And they had advantages that the Americans lacked. Direct connections to sources of supply in the Middle East and Asia, long experience with international smuggling, a culture of Omertà that was stronger and deeper than anything that existed among the American families. Tommaso understood all of this. He saw the chance that heroin represented, and he saw his own possible role as a bridge between Sicily and America, someone who could connect the supply chain from source to street. But he was also smart enough to move carefully, to build relationships instead of just showing up and demanding a piece of the action. He spent months in New York meeting with members of various families. He was always introduced by Bonanno, or one of his top men. He was always respectful of the rules that governed interactions between different criminal groups. He ate in their restaurants. He went to their social events. And slowly, he earned their trust. What struck him most about the American mafiosi was how different they were from their Sicilian counterparts. The Americans were flashier, more showy, more willing to attract attention. They drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, went to expensive nightclubs. They seemed to have forgotten, or maybe never learned, that the first rule of the mafia was to be invisible, to operate in the shadows, not the spotlight. But they had money, a lot of it, and they had access to the richest drug market in the world. If you could get heroin into New York, you could sell it at prices that made even the most ambitious cigarette smuggler's mouth water. Tommaso returned to Sicily in 1957 with plans, with connections, and with a vision of how to make himself and his associates richer than they had ever imagined. But making that vision happen would require infrastructure, organization, and above all, cooperation from other families within Cosa Nostra. He began to travel widely, not just within Sicily, but to mainland Italy, to France, to Switzerland, to Brazil. Each trip expanded his network, created new possibilities, laid the groundwork for the drug empire he was building. He became known as Don Messino. That was a nickname that showed both respect and affection. His reputation grew as someone who could make things happen, who could coordinate complex operations across continents. In 1959, he was arrested for the first time on serious charges. Murder and attempted murder. It came from a feud within Palermo's underworld. He spent time in jail waiting for trial, and there he got his first real taste of what prison meant for a man of honor. Inside, he was respected, feared, given special treatment by other prisoners. The guards handled him carefully. They knew that men on the outside could reach their families if he gave the word. When the trial finally came, witnesses changed their stories. Evidence disappeared, and he was found not guilty. The experience taught him that the law was flexible, that justice could be negotiated, that with the right connections and the right amount of money, even murder charges could be made to go away. It was a lesson that reinforced his belief in the power of Cosa Nostra and his place within it. But it also planted a seed of something else, something he would not recognize for decades. An understanding that the system could fail, that sometimes the guilty went free, not because they were innocent, but because the machinery of justice was corrupted by the very organization he served. By 1960, the heroin pipeline that Tommaso had helped build was flowing smoothly. Morphine base came from Turkey. It was refined in labs in Sicily or in Marseille through the French connection. Then it was smuggled into the United States through various routes. In suitcases with false bottoms, in diplomatic pouches, in shipments of legal goods, once in America. It was spread through networks of Sicilian immigrants who ran pizza places and Italian restaurants. Those businesses were perfect covers for drug operations. This was the start of what would later be called the Pizza Connection. It was a huge drug trafficking operation. At its peak, it was bringing in hundreds of kilograms of heroin every year and generating billions of dollars in revenue. And Tommaso Buscetta was one of its main builders. The money was staggering. Tommaso bought property. He invested in businesses. He supported an increasingly comfortable lifestyle. But he was also careful, more careful than many of his associates. He knew that attention from law enforcement was the great enemy. The moment you became visible, you became vulnerable. He kept multiple homes. He used fake names. He kept his wealth hidden or invested in ways that were hard to trace. In 1963, at age 35, Tommaso Buscetta was at the top of his power. He was rich, respected, connected to criminal groups across several continents. He had a wife and children, a position of honor within Cosa Nostra, a future that seemed unlimited. But that same year, something happened that would start the slow unraveling of everything he had built. The first Mafia war broke out in Palermo. It was a bloody conflict that pitted traditional families against each other. They were fighting for control of the organization's most profitable rackets. In the violence and chaos that followed, Tommaso would get his first glimpse of what Cosa Nostra was becoming. Not an organization bound by honor and tradition, but a killing machine that destroyed its own people with the same ruthlessness it showed to outsiders. The storm was gathering, and Tommaso Buscetta, who thought he understood the rules of the game he was playing, was about to learn that the rules had changed. The first Mafia war started with a murder. That is how most Mafia wars start. In December 1963, Calcedonio di Pisa was shot and killed in Palermo. He was a powerful boss with ties to the heroin trade. The killing broke the rules. Di Pisa should have been untouchable without permission from the commission. It was a sign that someone was challenging the established order. What followed was a year of bloodshed. Over 100 mafiosi died. Bodies turned up in cars, in ditches, dissolved in acid, fed to pigs. The violence was unheard of in its scale and its cruelty. It horrified the traditional bosses. They remembered when Cosa Nostra settled disputes through negotiation and compromise instead of mass slaughter. Tommaso Buscetta was not directly involved in the war's early stages, but he watched the killing with growing worry. He had been raised to believe that Cosa Nostra was an organization built on rules, on respect for the chain of command, on codes that separated men of honor from common criminals. But what he was seeing looked like nothing more than gang warfare. Families turning on each other over money and territory. Old rules being thrown aside when they got in the way. The war eventually wound down because everyone was exhausted, not because there was a real solution. Too many men were dead. Too much attention had been focused on Sicily. The surviving bosses realized that continuing to fight would destroy them all. An uneasy peace was made. but the damage was done. The first Mafia war had shown that once violence was let loose, it was hard to control, and that some men were willing to kill without limits to get power. For Tommaso, the war's most important result was that it made Sicily too hot. The Italian police, embarrassed by the number of bodies and pushed by public opinion, were cracking down on known mafiosi. Arrests were up, surveillance was tighter. It was getting harder to do business without drawing unwanted attention. The solution was obvious, leave, and so in 1964, Tommaso moved his base of operations to Mexico. He set himself up in Mexico City. He kept his connections to Sicily and the United States. Mexico had many advantages. Law enforcement was less aggressive. Its location was good for coordinating drug shipments, and bribes were simply the cost of doing business there. His wife Melchiora and their children stayed in Sicily. This was both practical and traditional. A man of honor was expected to have a respectable family life back home, even if his business required him to spend months or years away. The separation was hard, but it was the price of the life he had chosen. Mexico City in the mid-1960s was a city of contrasts. Gleaming modern buildings rose next to old colonial architecture. Rich neighborhoods where the wealthy lived behind high walls. Spreading slums where the poor struggled to survive. For someone from Palermo, the similarities were obvious. Mexico, like Sicily, had a long history of official corruption and unofficial power structures. The government was not truly democratic, but authoritarian, and the police, like police everywhere, could be bought. Tommaso settled in carefully. He opened legal businesses, import-export companies that gave cover for his drug trafficking operations. He built relationships with corrupt officials. He paid what needed to be paid to make sure his activities were ignored, and he kept his connections to both Sicily and the United States. He served as a crucial link in the heroin pipeline that was making everyone involved incredibly rich. The late 1960s were golden years for the international heroin trade. American demand was exploding. It was fueled partly by Vietnam War veterans coming home with habits they had developed during their service. The French Connection, the Marseille-based operation that turned Turkish morphine into heroin, was at its peak. The Sicilian-American pipeline that Tommaso had helped build was flowing smoothly. Profits were measured in millions of dollars per month, but success brought its own problems. The more money flowing through the system, the more people who wanted a piece. New families in Sicily were demanding to be included. American law enforcement, especially the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the predecessor to the D, was getting better at tracking international drug operations. And within Cosa Nostra itself, tensions were growing between the traditionalists and a new generation that saw the drug trade as the future. Tommaso handled these tensions with the skills he had developed over 2 decades in this life. He was diplomatic, respectful to his elders, generous with those below him in the chain of command. He understood that in an organization built on personal relationships and mutual obligation, keeping good relations with everyone was essential to survival. In 1968, he was arrested during a trip to the United States. The charges were related to drug trafficking. The arrest came from cooperation between Mexican and American law enforcement. It suggested that his name was becoming known to authorities on both sides of the border. He spent several months in jail before being released on bail. He immediately jumped bail. He disappeared into Brazil with the help of contacts in the international criminal underworld. Brazil became his new home, specifically São Paulo. The city was in many ways like Mexico City, huge, chaotic, corrupt, indifferent to the activities of foreign criminals, as long as they paid their bribes and kept their violence private. He set himself up in a nice neighborhood. He lived well, but not showy. He kept up the appearance of a successful businessman with vague connections to import-export. From Brazil, he continued to coordinate heroin shipments. He kept his network going. He made money, but he was also increasingly living as a fugitive, always aware that law enforcement in multiple countries wanted him, always ready to move at a moment's notice, always keeping his passport current and an escape route planned. The paranoia was justified. In 1970, Italian authorities issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of mafia association and drug trafficking. The warrant was based on testimony from small-time criminals, on surveillance reports, on the patient work of investigators who were starting to understand how the international drug trade operated. Tommaso Buscetta was named as one of the key figures in a conspiracy that stretched from Sicily to New York, from Turkey to Mexico. But being wanted and being caught were two different things. Brazil had no extradition treaty with Italy. As long as he stayed in Brazil, he was safe from Italian arrest warrants. The question was how long he could keep that safety, and what price would eventually be required to keep it. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, Tommaso Buscetta was 42 years old. He had been a made member of Cosa Nostra for more than 20 years. He had built an international empire, made millions of dollars, established himself as one of the most successful drug traffickers in the world. He had a wife and children in Sicily, though he saw them rarely. He had respect, power, and wealth, but he was also beginning to understand that the life he had chosen came with a price. It went beyond the risk of arrest or imprisonment. The Cosa Nostra he had joined as a young man, the organization that supposedly stood for honor and tradition, for protecting the weak, was changing into something else, something darker and more ruthless. And the question he would eventually have to answer was whether he could remain part of that organization, as it destroyed everything he claimed to value. The 1970s were both the peak and the beginning of the end for the old Cosa Nostra. Few understood that at the time. For Tommaso Buscetta, living in comfortable exile in Brazil, the decade started with profits beyond anything he had previously imagined. The heroin trade was a money machine that printed cash faster than it could be counted, let alone cleaned. From his base in São Paulo, Tommaso coordinated a huge network that spanned continents. His organization moved heroin from Turkey through Sicily to the United States. Each step of the process was carefully managed to minimize risk and maximize profit. The morphine base was bought through intermediaries in the Middle East. It was shipped to labs in Sicily. These were hidden in rural estates, in isolated farmhouses, in places where the smell of chemicals being mixed would not attract attention. There, chemists with training from the French Connection, which American and French authorities had taken apart in 1972, turned the morphine base into pure heroin. The heroin was then smuggled to the United States through various routes. Some went directly, hidden in shipping containers of legal goods. Some traveled through South America, with Venezuela and Brazil serving as transit points. Some went through Canada, where law enforcement was less aggressive than in the United States. And all of it eventually found its way to the streets of New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, and a dozen other American cities where demand was endless. The pizza connection was in full swing during these years. It would not get that name until law enforcement started taking it apart in the 1980s. The operation was brilliant in its simplicity. Sicilian immigrants opened pizza places and Italian restaurants throughout the United States. These businesses were ordinary and therefore invisible. They served as both distribution points and money laundering operations. Heroin went out the back door in small amounts. Cash came in the front door, mixed with regular restaurant receipts. The whole thing looked like a modestly successful small business. Tommaso was not directly involved in the street-level operations. He was too important, too valuable to risk that kind of exposure. His role was coordination and organization, making sure that supply met demand, that arguments were settled, that everyone got paid their share, that the pipeline kept flowing. He was the manager of an empire, the CEO of a corporation that happened to trade in addiction and death. The profits were staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that the pizza connection was bringing several hundred kilograms of heroin into the United States each year by the mid-1970s. Its street value was in the billions of dollars. Even after paying all the middlemen who had to be compensated, covering the costs of production and smuggling, paying tribute to various mafia families, the people at the top of the operation, people like Tommaso Buscetta, were making millions of dollars per year. But money, as Tommaso was learning, created its own problems. The more money you made, the more attention you attracted. American law enforcement, especially the Drug Enforcement Administration, created in 1973, was getting better at tracking international drug operations. Financial investigators were learning to follow money trails through banks and shell companies. And informants, tempted by the chance for lighter sentences or witness protection, were starting to talk. Tommaso's response was to become even more careful, even more focused on security. He used multiple identities. He traveled on fake passports from several different countries. He communicated through middlemen. He avoided phone calls that could be tapped or recorded. He kept his personal life separate from his business. He never discussed criminal matters at home or in places where conversations could be overheard. And he kept a low profile. He avoided the showiness that drew attention to so many successful criminals. Life in Brazil suited him. São Paulo was a city where a wealthy foreigner could live comfortably without being noticed, where the police were more interested in collecting bribes than investigating crimes, where extradition was unlikely as long as you kept good relations with the right people. He lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood. He drove a nice car. He ate in good restaurants. He generally enjoyed the rewards of his criminal success. But exile, no matter how comfortable, was still exile. He missed Sicily, missed the narrow streets of Palermo, missed the food and the language and the culture that had shaped him. He missed his children, who were growing up without him, and he missed the sense of belonging that came from being part of something bigger than himself, from being a member of Cosa Nostra in Sicily, rather than a fugitive living on the other side of the world. In 1972, after 8 years of separation, he divorced his first wife, Melchiora. The divorce was handled quietly through intermediaries. It freed him to pursue other relationships in Brazil. He met and eventually married Cristina de Almeida Guimarães. She was a Brazilian woman who knew nothing about his criminal past and believed he was a regular businessman. They would have 2 children together. His family grew even as it became more spread out across continents. But even as Tommaso tried to build a normal life in Brazil, events in Sicily were moving in directions that would eventually pull him back into the violent world he had tried to leave behind. A new generation of mafiosi was rising to power. They had none of the traditional scruples that had governed the old Cosa Nostra, and chief among them were the Corleonesi. This was the faction from the small town of Corleone that would eventually change the mafia from a secret criminal group into a terrorist army. The Corleonesi were led by 3 men: Luciano Leggio, a cunning and ruthless boss who understood that power belonged to those willing to kill without hesitation; Salvatore Toto, Rina, a short, brutal man whose smile never reached his eyes, and Bernardo Provenzano, the quiet one, the accountant, the man who kept careful records and planned methodically. These men represented everything that Tommaso had been taught the mafia should not be. They were vulgar, violent, indiscriminate. They killed not just rivals, but anyone who got in their way. Judges, police officers, journalists, politicians, bystanders. They dealt in drugs without hesitation. They saw narcotics as simply the most profitable racket available. And they had no respect for the old codes, the traditions that supposedly separated men of honor from common criminals. Throughout the 1970s, the Corleonesi steadily gained power. They got rid of rivals and gathered allies through a combination of violence and strategic alliances. The traditional families in Palermo, families like Porta Nuova, families that Tommaso had grown up with and served, watched with growing alarm as these outsiders from Corleone challenged the established order. But the traditional families were held back by their respect for rules, by their belief that there were limits to what a man of honor could do. The Corleonesi had no such limits. They killed whoever needed to be killed, whenever they needed to be killed. And they did it with a ruthlessness that shocked even hardened mafiosi. Tommaso, watching from Brazil, understood what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it. He was too far away, too removed from the daily politics of Sicily to influence events, and part of him did not want to be involved. He had his own life, his own business, his own family. Let others fight over control of Cosa Nostra in Sicily. He would continue to make money from his safe distance in Brazil. But the past has a way of catching up with you, especially when you have spent your life in the mafia. And Tommaso Buscetta's past, the oaths he had sworn, the organization he had joined, the codes he had lived by, was about to reach across continents and destroy everything he had built. In 1978, Italian authorities made another attempt to arrest him. They had been building a case for years, gathering evidence, tracking his movements, working with law enforcement agencies in multiple countries. They knew he was in Brazil. They knew approximately where he was living. They asked for his extradition on charges of mafia association and drug trafficking. The Brazilian government, under pressure from Italy and the United States, agreed to consider the request. Tommaso hired expensive lawyers. He paid substantial bribes. He fought the extradition through every legal channel available. But he also began making backup plans, preparing to flee Brazil if the courts ruled against him. The question was where to go. Europe was too dangerous, too many arrest warrants, too much cooperation between law enforcement agencies. The United States was out of the question. He was wanted there too. That left other parts of South America, or perhaps returning to Sicily and going into hiding there. But before he could make a decision, events in Sicily took a turn that would make all his careful planning irrelevant. The Second Mafia War was about to begin, and this time, Tommaso Buscetta would not be able to stay on the sidelines. The Corleonesi were coming for everyone, and they were especially interested in the old guard of Palermo, who represented the traditional way of doing things. The golden years were ending. The storm that had been gathering for 2 decades was about to break, and it would wash away everything in blood. Before going forward, remember, if you are enjoying the video, smash the like button and drop a comment. The original and earliest upload is always here. Appreciate you watching on the real channel. The Second Mafia War did not start with a bang, but with a series of small ripples that gradually built into a wave. The first clear sign came on April 23, 1981. Stefano Bontade, one of the most powerful traditional bosses in Palermo, was shot and killed on his birthday. He was sitting in his car, unarmed and unprotected. When assassins opened fire with automatic weapons, they killed him instantly. Bontade's death was shocking. Not because mafiosi do not get killed, they do, regularly. But because of who he was and how he died. He was the boss of the Santa Maria di Gesù family, one of the most respected families in Palermo. A man who sat on the commission and commanded the loyalty of hundreds of soldiers. He should have been untouchable without authorization from the highest levels of Cosa Nostra. His murder meant that someone had decided the old rules no longer applied. That someone was Toto Riina and the Corleonesi. 3 months later, in September 1981, Salvatore Inzerillo was killed. Inzerillo was the boss of the Passo di Regano family, another major Palermo family and a close ally of Bontade. His murder, coming so soon after Bontade's, made it clear that this was not an isolated killing. It was the opening of a war. And it was a war that the Corleonesi had planned carefully. They had lists of targets, schedules for eliminations, strategies for dealing with resistance. The Corleonesi's plan was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its execution. They intended to get rid of not just their rivals, but entire families, wiping out not just bosses, but underbosses, soldiers, and even relatives who might seek revenge. It was genocide within the Mafia, a purge designed to leave the Corleonesi as the unquestioned rulers of Cosa Nostra in Sicily. And they had the means to carry it out. Years of careful recruitment had given them a small army of young, ruthless killers who were willing to murder on command. They had gathered weapons, not just handguns, but assault rifles, explosives, and even remote detonated bombs. And most importantly, they had surprise. The traditional families had spent decades operating according to rules that limited violence. They were psychologically unprepared for the total war that the Corleonesi unleashed. Tommaso Buscetta, still in Brazil, watched the killing unfold with growing horror. The men being killed were people he had known for decades, people he had worked with, people he had considered friends. Bontade and Inzerillo had been his allies in the international drug trade, partners who had helped him build the pipeline that made them all rich, and now they were dead, cut down by killers who cared nothing for the traditions and codes that had supposedly bound Cosa Nostra together. But worse was coming. In 1982, the killings expanded to include not just mafiosi, but their families, the Corleonesi, determined to eliminate all possibility of revenge, began murdering the sons, brothers, nephews, and cousins of their victims. It was a violation of one of the most sacred rules of Cosa Nostra. Women and children were supposed to be off limits, removed from the violence that men chose to engage in. Tommaso's own family was not spared in Brazil, living in what he had thought was safe exile. He received the phone call that would change his life. His sons, Benedetto and Antonio, had been murdered in Sicily. The details were unclear. Such details always were when bodies had been made to disappear rather than found. But the message was clear. The Corleonesi were coming for everyone connected to the old families. And living on the other side of the world was no protection. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the rage. His sons had not been mafiosi. They were young men still in their 20s. They had their lives ahead of them. Benedetto had been studying to be a lawyer. Antonio had been helping with the family's legal businesses. Neither had been involved in criminal activities. Neither had sworn oaths to Cosa Nostra. Neither had done anything to deserve death. But they had been Tommaso Buscetta's sons, and that was enough in the Corleonesi's calculation. They were potential avengers, future problems, loose ends that needed to be tied up, so they were killed, murdered for the crime of being related to a man who represented the old order that the Corleonesi were determined to destroy. And the murders did not stop there. Tommaso's brother Vincenzo was killed. His son-in-law Giuseppe Di Maggio was killed. His nephew was killed. His brother-in-law was killed, one by one. The Corleonesi worked their way through his family tree. They eliminated anyone who might seek revenge. They sent a message that was impossible to misunderstand. There was no safety, no protection, no place far enough to escape their reach. In September 1982, Tommaso made the fateful decision to return to Sicily. It was, by any rational calculation, insane. He was wanted by Italian authorities. He knew the Corleonesi were hunting him. Returning meant walking into the lion's den, but rationality had nothing to do with it. His family was being slaughtered, and a Sicilian man, a man of honor, could not remain in hiding while his blood relatives were murdered. He traveled under a false name. He used one of the many fake passports he had gathered over the years. He slipped into Sicily quietly. He contacted trusted associates. He tried to understand the full extent of what was happening. And what he learned was even worse than he had feared. The Mafia war was not winding down. It was escalating. Bodies were turning up regularly, sometimes multiple bodies per day. The Corleonesi were not just winning. They had effectively already won. The traditional families had been devastated. Their leadership was gone. Their soldiers were scattered or absorbed into the Corleonesi's organization. The Palermo that Tommaso had known, the city where multiple families had coexisted in a tense balance of power, was gone. In its place was a mafia dictatorship ruled by Toto Riina through terror and murder. Some of the surviving traditionalists wanted to fight back, to organize resistance against the Corleonesi. But it was too late. The Corleonesi had too many soldiers, too much firepower, too much momentum. Any attempted resistance would simply result in more bodies, more families destroyed, more widows and orphans. Tommaso made contact with some of his old allies. The ones who were still alive, they met in secret, in safe houses, always watching for surveillance or betrayal, or discussed options, strategies, possibilities, but increasingly, the only real question was not how to fight back, but how to survive. In October 1983, while hiding in an apartment in Brazil, he had returned there after his brief and disastrous trip to Sicily. Tommaso was arrested. The Brazilian federal police, acting on information from Italian authorities and the DL, raided his hiding place. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase. He was a 55-year-old man, exhausted and grieving. He surrendered without resistance. The arrest should have been just another setback in a life filled with them. Another jail cell, another legal battle, another extradition fight. But something had changed inside Tommaso Buscetta. The deaths of his sons, the murder of his family, the systematic destruction of everything he had believed in. It had broken something fundamental. The Cosa Nostra he had joined as a young man, the organization that was supposed to be about honor and respect and protecting your own, had become a death cult that murdered children. The codes he had sworn to uphold, the Omertà that banned cooperation with authorities under any circumstances, they now seemed not like sacred oaths, but like chains that bound him to an organization that had betrayed everything it claimed to represent. In his cell in São Paulo, waiting to learn whether he would be sent to Italy or the United States, Tommaso Buscetta began to think thoughts that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Thoughts about breaking Omertà, thoughts about cooperation, thoughts about revenge against the Corleonesi, who had destroyed his family. He was not yet ready to take that step. The conditioning of decades, the oaths sworn on burning holy cards, the psychological investment in the identity of man of honor. All of these things held him back from the edge of betrayal, but he was moving in that direction, pushed by grief and rage and a growing sense that the Mafia itself had committed the ultimate betrayal by abandoning the codes that gave it legitimacy. In April 1984, after months of legal maneuvering, Brazil agreed to send him to Italy. The Americans had also asked for him, but the Italians got there first. Italian prosecutors were determined to try him for mafia association and drug trafficking. He was put on a plane, heavily guarded, flown across the Atlantic to face justice in the country of his birth. When the plane landed in Rome, Tommaso Buscetta was met by a small army of police officers, journalists, and photographers. He was 56 years old, gray-haired, tired-looking, but still holding the dignified bearing of a man who had spent his life as someone important, someone who mattered. As the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, he said nothing. He kept the silence that had been drilled into him for decades. But that silence would not last, because waiting for him in Rome was a young magistrate named Giovanni Falcone, a man who would become his confessor, his ally, and ultimately his friend. A man who understood that Tommaso Buscetta was at a crossroads, and who would give him a path toward redemption, or at least toward revenge. The moment that would change Italian history was approaching, and Tommaso Buscetta, the man who had built empires and commanded respect across continents, was about to do something that no high-ranking mafioso had ever done before. Tell the truth, to understand the full horror of the Second Mafia War, to understand why Tommaso Buscetta would eventually make the choice that defined his legacy. We must look more closely at the systematic cruelty that characterized those years. The statistics tell part of the story. Over 1,000 murders between 1981 and 1983. That made Palermo one of the most dangerous cities in the world. But statistics cannot show the psychological terror that filled Sicilian society during those years. When being related to a mafioso meant you might be murdered in your sleep, when children disappeared and their bodies were never found, when the line between fighter and civilian ceased to exist, the Corleonese's killing machine operated with industrial efficiency. They had death squads, teams of young, hardened killers who worked from lists, checking off names as they completed each killing. They used a variety of methods: shootings in broad daylight, car bombs, strangulations. People simply disappearing into lupara bianca, white shotgun. That was the Sicilian term for a murder, where the body is never found. The psychological warfare was as important as the actual killings. The Corleonesi wanted not just to eliminate their enemies, but to terrorize them, to make them understand that resistance was pointless, that surrender was the only path to survival. They killed slowly sometimes. They made victims suffer. They let word spread about what happened to those who opposed them. They killed family members. They made their targets watch or learn about it afterward. They were fighting not just a war, but conducting a genocide, eliminating not just individuals but entire bloodlines. The traditional families tried to fight back, but they were held back by their adherence to rules that the Corleonesi had thrown away. When Bantade was killed, his family wanted to strike back immediately, to hit Rina and the Corleonesi with the same cruelty they had shown. But the old bosses counseled patience. They argued for trying to settle the conflict through the commission. They said that escalating the violence would destroy everyone. By the time they understood that the Corleonesi had no interest in negotiation, that this was a war of elimination, it was too late. The leadership was dead or in hiding. The soldiers were scattered. The infrastructure that had taken generations to build was shattered. The Passo di Rigano family, headed by Salvatore Inzerillo until his murder, was hit especially hard after Inzerillo's death. The Corleonesi went after his entire family with a thoroughness that shocked even hardened mafiosi. His brother was killed. His sons were killed, including a teenage boy who had never been involved in criminal activity. His cousins were killed by the time the purge was complete. Over 30 members of the Inzerillo family and their associates had been murdered. The Santa Maria di Gesù family, Bontade's family, suffered similar losses. Bontade's underbosses were systematically eliminated. His soldiers were given a choice: join the Corleonesi or die. Most chose to join. They understood that loyalty to a dead boss was a luxury they could not afford. The few who refused, or who the Corleonesi considered too dangerous to keep, were killed. For Tommaso Buscetta, watching from Brazil, each murder was personal. These were men he had known, men he had worked with, men he had trusted. The old Palermo, the city, where families had coexisted in a complex ecosystem of rivalry and cooperation, was being replaced by a mafia dictatorship where one family ruled through terror. But it was not just the murders that horrified him. It was the violation of every code he had been taught to revere. The Corleonesi killed women, something that was supposed to be absolutely forbidden. They killed children, another unthinkable violation. They killed judges and police officers. That attracted the kind of attention that the mafia had traditionally tried to avoid. They used explosives and car bombs, methods that endangered civilians and violated the mafia's supposed code of limiting violence to participants in the life. In June 1982, Tommaso learned that even this level of horror had not reached its limit. His sons, Benedetto and Antonio, had been lured to a meeting with a promise of safety, of negotiation, of a way to avoid further bloodshed. Instead, they had been murdered. The details of how they died were never confirmed. Some said they had been strangled. Others said they had been shot. Still others claimed they had been dissolved in acid. It did not matter. What mattered was that they were dead, killed for the crime of being Tommaso Buscetta's sons. The news reached him in a phone call, the same way bad news always seemed to travel in the mafia. A coded conversation that said everything while saying nothing specific. He hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time, his mind unable to process what he had just learned. His sons, his boys, dead. His wife, Christina, found him there, sitting motionless. She knew immediately that something terrible had happened. She tried to comfort him. But what comfort could there be? He had spent his life as a criminal, had made choices that led directly to this moment. And now his sons had paid the price for his decisions. In the days that followed, more news arrived. His brother Vincenzo was killed, and his son-in-law, and his nephew. The Corleonesi were working their way through his family tree systematically, eliminating anyone who might seek revenge, sending a message that was impossible to ignore. There would be no survivors, no one left to carry on the vendetta. Tommaso thought about suicide during those dark days. He had a gun. It would have been easy to end his own pain, but something held him back. Perhaps pride, perhaps a desire for revenge, perhaps simply the stubborn refusal to give Rina and the Corleonesi the satisfaction of driving him to self-destruction. Instead, he made plans to return to Sicily. It was irrational, suicidal even. But rationality had no place in decisions driven by grief and rage. He needed to see with his own eyes what had become of his world. He needed to touch Sicilian soil, to breathe Sicilian air, to remind himself that he was still a man and not just a coward hiding on the other side of the world. While his family was slaughtered, the trip was brief and disastrous. He slipped into Sicily in September 1982. He used fake documents and disguises. He moved from safe house to safe house. He met with the few allies who remained alive. What he found was a Sicily changed by terror. The traditional bosses who had survived were broken men hiding in holes, jumping at shadows, knowing that every day might be their last. The Corleonesi were triumphant, building a new mafia in their image, recruiting from the rubble of the families they had destroyed. Some of the survivors wanted to fight. They talked about reorganizing, about striking back, about making the Corleonesi pay for their crimes, but it was empty talk. The fantasy of desperate men who could not accept that they had lost. The Corleonesi had too many soldiers, too much firepower, too much momentum. Any attempt at organized resistance would simply give them more targets. Tommaso met with some of his old associates, men he had known since his youth. They talked about the old days, about the mafia as it had been, about codes and honor and the way things were supposed to be. And they all understood, though no one said it directly, that they were mourning not just their dead relatives and friends, but the death of an entire way of life. One conversation from that trip stayed with Tommaso for the rest of his life. He met with an old mafioso, a man in his 70s who had been brought into Cosa Nostra in the 1930s, who had lived through the Mussolini repression and the war and the rebuilding. They sat in a dimly lit room drinking espresso, talking in the coded language that mafiosi used even in private. "This isn't Cosa Nostra anymore," the old man said. His voice was bitter. "This is something else. These Corleonesi, they're not men of honor, they're beasts. They've taken something sacred and turned it into this. What can we do?" Tommaso asked, though he already knew the answer. The old man shrugged. "Die with dignity, if we're lucky. That's all that's left to us now. The mafia we knew is dead. What's left is just a corpse wearing its skin." Tommaso returned to Brazil after a few weeks. He had accomplished nothing except confirming what he already suspected. The war was over. The Corleonesi had won. The only question was how many more people would die before everyone accepted reality. But the Corleonesi were not done with him. In 1983, they tried to kill him in Brazil. Gunmen appeared outside his home. Only luck he happened to be out when they arrived saved him from the same fate as his sons. The message was clear. Distance was no protection. Exile was no safety. The Corleonesi's reach extended across continents. It was shortly after this attempt that Tommaso was arrested by Brazilian police. And it was in his cell, waiting to learn his fate, that he began to seriously think about the unthinkable. Breaking Omertà, cooperating with authorities, betraying Cosa Nostra. The internal struggle was agonizing. Everything in his training, every oath he had sworn, every lesson he had learned in 4 decades as a mafioso, it all screamed at him that cooperation with authorities was the ultimate betrayal. The one unforgivable sin, a man of honor went to prison, served his time, kept his mouth shut, maintained his dignity. These were the rules. These were the codes. These were what separated men of honor from rats. But what honor was there in staying silent while the Corleonesi murdered children? What dignity was there in protecting an organization that had violated every code it claimed to uphold? What loyalty was owed to people who had systematically eliminated his family? The mafia had broken Omertà first. He told himself, by killing his sons, by murdering women and children, by changing Cosa Nostra from an organization with rules into a death cult, they had violated the sacred agreement that bound members together. If they had broken the oath, if they had betrayed the codes, then what duty did he have to stay silent? It was rationalization, perhaps, a way of justifying what he was already leaning toward. But it was also true. The Corleonesi had destroyed the mafia that Tommaso had joined. They had replaced it with something unrecognizable in that sense. Cooperating with authorities was not betraying Cosa Nostra. It was avenging it, striking back at the usurpers who had stolen its name and perverted its purpose. When the Brazilian courts ruled that he would be sent to Italy rather than the United States, Tommaso felt something close to relief. Italy meant Italian prosecutors, Italian judges, Italian courts, and in Italy, there was a young magistrate named Giovanni Falcone. He had been building cases against the mafia for years. He understood how the organization worked. He might be able to use information from someone on the inside to strike a real blow against the Corleonesi. As the plane carried him across the Atlantic toward Rome toward prosecution, toward a decision that would change his life and Italian history, Tommaso Buscetta was still not entirely sure what he would do. The habit of silence was strong. It had been practiced for decades. But so was the rage, the grief, the desire for revenge against the people who had murdered his children. The moment of decision was approaching, and when it came, Tommaso Buscetta would shock the mafia, Italian society, and even himself. He would choose truth over silence, cooperation over loyalty, revenge over honor. The Ucciardone prison in Palermo was built in the 1830s, a massive fortress designed to hold the most dangerous criminals in Sicily. Its high walls had witnessed over a century of human suffering, revolutionaries and bandits, murderers and thieves, and more recently, mafiosi whose power outside the walls often extended inside them as well. It was to Ucciardone that Tommaso Buscetta was taken after his arrival in Italy. He was placed in a maximum security cell, isolated from other prisoners, watched around the clock. The isolation was both for his protection and for security. The Corleonesi wanted him dead. They had resources even inside prison. The Italian authorities wanted him alive, at least long enough to be tried on the charges that had piled up against him over the years. And Tommaso himself was still wrestling with the decision that would define his legacy. Judge Giovanni Falcone arrived at the prison on July 16, 1984. He was 45 years old, younger than Tommaso. A thin man with glasses and the quiet intensity of someone who had dedicated his life to a single purpose. Falcone had grown up in Palermo. He had seen the mafia's power firsthand. He had chosen to become a magistrate, specifically to fight the organization that had corrupted his city. For years, Falcone had been investigating the mafia, trying to understand how it worked, building cases that usually fell apart when witnesses refused to testify or were murdered before trial. He had studied the American experience with La Cosa Nostra. He had read about informants like Joe Valachi, who had broken Omertà. He understood that the key to really damaging the mafia was getting someone from the inside to explain how the organization worked. But Italy had never had a pentito, repentant one, of Buscetta's level. There had been minor criminals who had cooperated, small fish trading information for lighter sentences, but never a high-ranking mafioso. Never someone who had been present at the highest levels of the organization. Never someone who could explain the structure that the mafia went to such lengths to hide. The first meeting between Falcone and Buscetta lasted 8 hours. They sat across from each other in a small room. Guards outside, a tape recorder running. They talked, or rather Falcone talked. He explained his understanding of the mafia. He described the cases he had built. He outlined the charges against Tommaso, and Tommaso listened, evaluating, trying to figure out if this magistrate was someone who could be trusted, someone who would use information properly, someone who genuinely wanted justice rather than simply another conviction. Falcone understood that this was a delicate moment. Push too hard, and Buscetta would retreat back into Omertà. Be too gentle, and he might think the magistrate was weak, someone who would not protect him from the inevitable retaliation. What Falcone did brilliantly was treat Buscetta with respect, not as a criminal or a traitor, but as someone who had important knowledge and who had legitimate grievances. "I know what they did to your family," Falcone said at one point. "I know about your sons. I know about your brother, your nephew, your son-in-law. I know the Corleonesi have been systematically eliminating everyone connected to you." Tommaso said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. This was not the usual interrogation, where police treated suspects like animals. This was something different. A conversation between two men who both understood the Mafia, who both hated what it had become, who might be able to help each other. "The Mafia that exists now is not the Mafia you joined," Falcone continued. "The Corleonesi have destroyed the traditions, the codes, everything that supposedly made Cosa Nostra different from a common criminal gang. They murder children, they use bombs, they kill judges and police officers. They've turned Palermo into a war zone." Still, Tommaso stayed silent, but he was listening carefully. "I can't bring your sons back," Falcone said softly. "Nothing I do can change what happened to them, but I can promise you this. If you help me, if you explain how the Mafia works, if you identify the people responsible for these murders, I will use that information to build cases that will put them in prison for the rest of their lives. I can't give you revenge, but I can give you justice, and maybe, just maybe, I can help prevent other fathers from losing their sons the way you lost yours." The meeting ended without Tommaso committing to anything, but Falcone knew he had planted a seed. Over the next few days, he returned to the prison. Each time they talked for hours, Falcone described his vision for a massive trial that would prosecute the entire leadership of the Mafia. That would use the organization's own structure against it. That would finally break the code of silence that had protected Cosa Nostra for over a century. And gradually, carefully, Tommaso began to open up, not about specifics at first, but about philosophy, about his understanding of what Cosa Nostra had been versus what it had become. He talked about the old codes, about the way things were supposed to work, about the change that had happened when the Corleonesi took over. "They've betrayed everything," Tommaso said during one of these sessions. His voice was bitter. Cosa Nostra was supposed to be about honor, about respect, about protecting the weak. My father was poor, but he had dignity, and Mafia was supposed to be about giving men like him protection, about standing up to those who abused power. But what is it now? It's become the thing it was supposed to protect people from. It's become a terrorist organization that murders children. Falcone listened. He asked occasional questions. He drew Tommaso out. And then carefully, he made his pitch. "Help me destroy them," Falcone said. "Not the Mafia. I know you can't betray that. Not entirely. But help me destroy the Corleonesi. Help me remove the people who murdered your sons, who betrayed the codes, who turned Cosa Nostra into a death cult. You say they're not real men of honor. Prove it. Show me who they are, what they've done, how they operate, and I promise you, I will use every legal tool available to make them pay." It was the perfect approach, the perfect frame. Falcone wasn't asking Tommaso to betray Cosa Nostra. He was asking him to save it, to restore it, to eliminate the corruption that had infected it. It was rationalization, certainly, but it was rationalization that allowed Tommaso to keep his sense of identity, his vision of himself as a man of honor, even as he prepared to do something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. On July 29, 1984, 13 days after the first meeting, Tommaso Buscetta made his decision. He would cooperate. He would break Omertà. He would tell Falcone everything he knew about Cosa Nostra, its structure, its people, its operations, its codes. He would explain how the Mafia worked, who gave orders, who carried them out, how decisions were made. The decision, once made, brought a sense of relief. For months, he had been carrying the weight of silence, the burden of secrets that pressed down on him like physical objects. Now, finally, he could speak. He could tell the truth. He could unburden himself of decades of knowledge that had become a curse rather than a treasure. But he also knew what this decision meant. He would be marked for death, hunted for the rest of his life. His family, what remained of it, would be in danger. He would be called a rat, a traitor, and infame. The Mafia would put a price on his head that would never be lifted. He would spend the rest of his life in hiding, looking over his shoulder, waiting for the bullet that would eventually find him. But his sons were already dead. His family was already destroyed. What did he have left to lose except his silence? And what good was silence when it protected the people who had murdered his children? The interrogations began in earnest. For months, Tommaso talked. Falcone listened. The tape recorder captured everything, building a record that would eventually become the foundation for the largest anti-mafia prosecution in Italian history. The information that flowed from Tommaso Buscetta during those months was unheard of in its detail and scope. For the first time, someone from the inside was explaining how Cosa Nostra actually worked, confirming theories that investigators had developed over decades, revealing things they had never suspected. First and foremost was the structure. Falcone and other investigators had known that the Mafia was organized, but they had not understood the full extent of the organizational hierarchy. Tommaso explained it all. At the bottom were the soldiers, made men who had been initiated into the organization and who followed orders from above. Above them were the capi, or captains. They commanded groups of soldiers. Above the captains were the bosses who controlled individual families. And above the bosses sat the commission, the cupola, a council of the most powerful bosses who made decisions affecting all of Cosa Nostra. The commission's existence had been suspected but never proven. Tommaso not only confirmed its existence, he explained how it worked, who sat on it, how decisions were made. He described the meetings he had attended, conversations he had taken part in, decisions that had been made about territory and rackets and murders. He explained the concept of representant. That was the representative who spoke for each family on the commission. He described how disputes were supposed to be settled, how permission for major operations had to be obtained, how the system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of warfare that the Corleonesi had unleashed. But most importantly, he named names, hundreds of them, thousands of them. He identified bosses, underbosses, soldiers. He explained which families controlled which territories. He described specific crimes, murders, drug deals, extortions, and identified who had ordered them, who had carried them out, who had benefited from them. Salvatore Riina, the boss of bosses, the head of the Corleonesi. Tommaso described him in detail, his background, his rise to power, his methods, his personality. He explained how Riina had systematically eliminated rivals, how he had taken control of the commission, how he had changed Cosa Nostra from a secret society into a terrorist organization. Bernardo Provenzano, Riina's partner, the quiet one who kept records and planned operations, Michel Greco, known as the Pope. He had served as the nominal head of the commission, while Riina pulled the strings from behind. Pippo Callo, the treasurer. He managed Cosa Nostra's finances and investments Gaetano Badalamenti. He had opposed the Corleonesi and had been forced into exile. For each name, Tommaso gave context, their position in the hierarchy, their relationships with other mafiosi, their specific crimes. He drew organizational charts, explained alliances and feuds, described a complicated web of relationships that bound Cosa Nostra together. He explained Omertà, the code of silence that every mafioso swore to uphold. He described the initiation ceremony in detail, the holy card, the blood, the fire, the oath. He explained the rules that govern behavior. No cooperation with authorities, no stealing from other men of honor, no involvement with the wives or daughters of other members. But he also explained how these rules were routinely violated. The Corleonesi, he noted, paid lip service to the codes while ignoring them in practice. They killed women and children. They cooperated with authorities when it suited their purposes, paying bribes and providing information about rivals. They broke every rule except the one about maintaining the fiction that the rules existed. Falcone was careful in his questioning. He confirmed details. He asked for elaboration. He made sure that what Tommaso was saying could be backed up by evidence. Because testimony, no matter how detailed, was not enough by itself, Italian law required that confessions from accomplices be supported by independent evidence before they could be used to secure convictions. But Tommaso was providing roadmaps, pointing investigators toward evidence that they could verify. He described properties where meetings had taken place, businesses that were fronts for criminal operations, bank accounts where money had been cleaned. He gave investigators the tools they needed to build cases that would hold up in court. The drug trade got special attention. Tommaso described the pizza connection in detail, how heroin was made in Sicily, smuggled to the United States, spread through pizza places and Italian restaurants. With profits flowing back to Sicily, he named the people involved at every level, from the chemists who turned morphine base into heroin to the distributors who sold it on American streets. He explained how drug deals were structured, how profits were divided, who got what percentage, how arguments were settled. He described specific shipments, specific meetings, specific transactions, and all of it was being recorded, written down, prepared for eventual use in court. But Tommaso was careful about what he revealed and what he held back. He talked a lot about the Corleonesi. He gave detailed information about their crimes and their structure. But he was more cautious about the traditionalists, about the old families that the Corleonesi had destroyed. He presented himself and his allies as victims rather than perpetrators, as men of honor who had been betrayed by those who claimed to be their brothers. It was, to some extent, self-serving. Tommaso was not confessing to his own crimes so much as he was documenting the crimes of his enemies. He admitted his involvement in criminal activities, but he described himself as someone who had always tried to follow the codes, who had opposed the Corleonesi's methods, who had been persecuted for his loyalty to tradition. Whether this was accurate or simply convenient rewriting of history, Falcone could not completely determine, but it did not matter. What mattered was that Tommaso was providing information that could be used to prosecute hundreds of mafiosi, to take apart the organization's structure, to show that Cosa Nostra was not a myth or a conspiracy theory, but a real criminal organization with identifiable members and a documented history of crimes. As the months passed and the interrogations continued, word began to leak out that something unheard of was happening. Lawyers for imprisoned mafiosi heard rumors that Buscetta was talking. Journalists picked up whispers that a major anti-mafia operation was being planned, and inside Cosa Nostra, panic began to spread as people realized that someone from the inside was cooperating with authorities. The Corleonesi put out a death sentence on Tommaso Buscetta. Not that one was needed. He had been marked for death since the moment he was arrested. But now it was official, announced, made known throughout the organization. Anyone who could kill Buscetta would be rewarded, honored, celebrated. His photograph was passed around. His possible locations were discussed. Plans were made, but Tommaso was beyond their reach. Locked in maximum security, guarded around the clock, with access limited to a small number of trusted personnel, he was the most protected man in Italy, because Italian authorities understood that his death would mean the end of the most important anti-mafia investigation in history. Inside the prison, Tommaso continued talking. He described his own criminal career in detail. The cigarette smuggling, the drug trafficking, the murders he had ordered or taken part in. He was confessing to crimes that would ordinarily result in life in prison. But he was doing so in the context of cooperation that might eventually result in some form of leniency. But more than leniency, what he seemed to want was to be heard. For decades, he had been bound by Omertà, unable to speak freely about the life he had lived, the things he had seen, the organization he had served. Now finally he could talk, and so he did, for hours every day, unburdening himself of secrets that had become too heavy to carry. He told Falcone about the old mafia, the one he had joined as a young man, the one that had supposedly stood for something beyond simple criminality. He described the traditional codes, the respect for civilians, the limits on violence, the sense that being a mafioso meant being part of something larger than yourself. And then he described what the Corleonesi had done to that organization, how they had taken something that was corrupt, but had at least pretended to have rules and turned it into a killing machine, how they had replaced honor with terror, respect with fear, codes with naked violence. They're not men of honor, Tommaso said repeatedly. They're beasts wearing human skin. They've destroyed Cosa Nostra from within, killed everything it was supposed to represent. What's left is just a name, an empty shell that they're using to justify murder. Whether this was an accurate historical assessment or a rationalization that allowed Tommaso to cooperate while keeping his self-image as a man of honor, historians still debate. But for Falcone's purposes, it did not matter. What mattered was that Tommaso was providing the keys to the kingdom, explaining how Cosa Nostra worked, identifying its members, describing its crimes. By December 1984, 6 months after the interrogations began, Falcone had gathered thousands of pages of testimony. He had the structure of Cosa Nostra laid out in detail. He had names, hundreds of them, thousands of them, with their positions in the hierarchy and their specific crimes documented. He had descriptions of how the drug trade worked, how money was cleaned, how murders were authorized and carried out. And he had something else, something even more important. He had proof that the mafia existed as a formal organization, rather than being merely a cultural attitude or a collection of independent criminals. This might seem obvious now, but in 1984, many Italian judges and politicians still denied that there was such a thing as a mafia in any organized sense. Buscetta's testimony destroyed that fiction. It showed beyond any doubt that Cosa Nostra was real, that it had structure and rules and hierarchy, that it could and should be prosecuted as an organization rather than as a collection of individuals. The stage was set for the Maxi Trial, the largest anti-mafia prosecution in history. And Tommaso Buscetta, once one of the most powerful criminals in the world, had become the star, witness in a legal proceeding that would change Italian society and forever change the mafia's relationship with the Italian state. The year 1985 was spent in preparation. Falcone and his team of investigators and prosecutors worked around the clock. They used Buscetta's testimony as a roadmap to gather supporting evidence. They interviewed hundreds of additional witnesses. They analyzed financial records. They got wiretaps and surveillance footage. They built a case that was unprecedented in its scope and ambition. The goal was bold: to prosecute not just individual criminals, but the entire structure of Cosa Nostra, to show that the Mafia was a unified organization, and that membership in that organization was itself a crime. To use Italian law specifically, Article 416 bis, which made Mafia association a criminal offense, to attack the organization at its foundations rather than simply prosecuting individual crimes. This required proving several things. First, that Cosa Nostra existed as a formal organization with a defined structure. Second, that the defendants were members of that organization. Third, that the organization engaged in criminal activity as its primary purpose. And fourth, that specific defendants had committed specific crimes in furtherance of the organization's goals. Buscetta's testimony provided the framework, but it needed to be supported by evidence that could stand up in court. Italian law was skeptical of accomplice testimony. It required that such testimony be backed up by independent evidence before it could be used to secure convictions. This meant that every claim Buscetta made needed to be verified through documents, physical evidence, or testimony from non-accomplice witnesses. The task was huge. Falcone's team grew to include dozens of investigators and prosecutors, all working under conditions of extreme secrecy and security. The Corleonesi had already shown they were willing to kill judges and police officers. Everyone involved in the investigation understood that they were targets. In May 1985, two more mafiosi decided to cooperate: Salvatore Contorno and Totuccio Contorno. They were members of traditional families that had been devastated by the Corleonesi. Like Buscetta, they had lost family members in the Second Mafia War. Like Buscetta, they described their cooperation as revenge against the Corleonesi rather than betrayal of Cosa Nostra itself. Their testimony supported much of what Buscetta had said. It provided additional details about the Mafia War. They described massacres they had witnessed, murders they had taken part in, meetings where killings had been planned. Their testimony was valuable, but they did not have Buscetta's credibility or prestige. He was the star witness, the one whose testimony carried the weight of authority. The arrest warrants began to go out in November 1985, hundreds of them. Issued at the same time to prevent targets from fleeing or warning each other, police raids happened across Sicily. They arrested bosses, underbosses, soldiers, anyone whose name appeared in Buscetta's testimony and whose crimes could be supported by evidence. Some of the targets were already in prison on other charges. They were simply moved to facilities where they could be held for the upcoming trial. Others were arrested at home, sometimes peacefully, sometimes after armed standoffs. A few managed to go into hiding. They became fugitives who would eventually be caught, but who would miss the initial trial. The most important target, Salvatore Rina, could not be found. He had gone into hiding years earlier. He was living as a fugitive in Palermo, moving from safe house to safe house, protected by loyalists who would die rather than betray him. The police knew approximately where he was, but they could not find him precisely enough to make an arrest. Bernardo Provenzano had also disappeared, living underground while continuing to manage Cosa Nostra's affairs. Michele Greco was arrested, as were dozens of other high-ranking mafiosi. But the absence of Rina and Provenzano meant that the leaders of the Corleonesi would not be present for the trial. That fact lessened the symbolic impact of the prosecution. Still, the sweep was unprecedented. By the end of 1985, over 400 suspected mafiosi were in custody. They were awaiting trial on charges ranging from mafia association to murder, from drug trafficking to extortion. The sheer scale of the operation made international news. Italy, long embarrassed by its inability to fight the mafia, was finally fighting back, but holding the prisoners was one thing. Prosecuting them was another. The trial would need to fit hundreds of defendants, each with their own lawyers, each entitled to present a defense. It would need a courtroom large enough to hold everyone, security strong enough to prevent escape or violence, and a judicial system capable of managing what would be one of the most complex legal proceedings in history. The solution was to build a special courtroom in the Uccergone prison compound. Construction began on a bunker-like facility that could handle the trial. It was designed with security as the main concern. Reinforced concrete walls, limited access, space for hundreds of defendants behind bars, raised areas for judges and prosecutors, room for lawyers and observers. The courtroom, when finished, looked more like a fortress than a judicial chamber. The defendants would sit behind bars, visible but contained. The judges would sit behind bulletproof glass. Armed guards would be placed throughout the facility. Every person entering would be searched, their identity verified, their purpose documented. It was necessary. The Mafia had already shown that it was willing to kill anyone who threatened it. Just months earlier, in July 1985, they had murdered Giuseppe Montana. He was a police officer who had been investigating drug trafficking. The message was clear: cooperate with the prosecution, and you would die. Despite the threats, witnesses came forward. Some were civilians who had seen crimes. Some were business owners who had been extorted. Some were family members of victims who wanted justice for their murdered relatives. And of course, there were the Pentiti, Buscetta, and the others who had broken Omertà and agreed to testify. Falcone understood that the trial would be a media event. He prepared accordingly. The prosecution's case would need to be presented clearly enough that ordinary Italians could understand it, dramatically enough that it would capture public attention, and thoroughly enough that it would survive the inevitable appeals. The indictment, when it was finally completed, ran to thousands of pages. It documented the structure of Cosa Nostra. It identified 475 defendants by name, and it described hundreds of specific crimes. It was the product of years of investigation, months of interrogation, and the combined effort of dozens of prosecutors and investigators. As 1985 turned into 1986, preparations for the trial entered their final phase. Security protocols were finalized. The courtroom was completed. Witnesses were prepared for their testimony. The defendants and their lawyers received copies of the indictment and began preparing their defense strategies. Everyone involved understood that this trial would be a turning point. If the prosecution succeeded, it would show that the state could fight the mafia, that the organization could be broken, that no one was above the law. If it failed, if defendants were found not guilty or the trial collapsed into chaos, it would encourage the mafia. It would discourage future cooperation from potential witnesses. The stakes could not have been higher, and at the center of it all was Tommaso Buscetta, the man whose decision to break Omertà had made the entire prosecution possible. He would be the first witness called, and his testimony would set the tone for everything that followed. In February 1986, the trial was ready to begin. The defendants were gathered in the specially built courtroom. The judges took their seats, the prosecutors prepared their opening statements, and Tommaso Buscetta, wearing a suit and tie, his gray hair neatly combed, his expression serious, prepared to take the stand. and explain to the world how the Mafia worked. The moment that would define his legacy had arrived, February 10th, 1986. The Maxi Trial, formerly known as the Maxi Processo, began in the specially built bunker courtroom in Palermo. Outside, crowds gathered. They were held back by police barricades. Journalists from around the world had come to Sicily to cover what was being called the trial of the century. Inside, 475 defendants sat behind bars. Some in the courtroom, others connected by video link from various prisons around Italy. The defendants were a cross-section of Cosa Nostra. There were elderly bosses who had been in the Mafia since the 1940s. There were young soldiers who had been brought in just years earlier. There were men accused of dozens of murders, and men whose only crime was Mafia association. Some kept the dignified bearing of men of honor. Others looked terrified. They understood that they were facing life in prison or worse. The judicial panel consisted of 2 professional judges and 6 lay judges' citizens chosen to take part in the proceeding. The presiding judge was Alfonso Giordano. He was a veteran jurist who understood the huge responsibility he carried. The prosecutors were led by Giovanni Falcone, along with his colleague Paolo Borsellino and several others. Together they represented the Italian state's determination to finally confront the Mafia. The defense was represented by an army of lawyers, some of Italy's most prominent attorneys. They had been hired by families willing to spend whatever it took to defend their relatives. Some of these lawyers were themselves suspected of Mafia ties, of serving as messengers between imprisoned bosses and their organizations on the outside. But they were officers of the court. They were entitled to represent their clients, and the prosecution had to accept their participation, even as they suspected collusion. The opening statements took days. Falcone and his team laid out the prosecution's case. That Cosa Nostra existed as a formal criminal organization, that the defendants were members of that organization, that they had engaged in systematic criminal activity, including murder, drug trafficking, extortion, and corruption. They described the structure of the organization, its codes and rules, its hierarchy and decision-making processes. And then they called their first witness, Tommaso Buscetta. The courtroom fell silent as he entered. He was 57 years old now, gray-haired and dignified, walking with the bearing of someone who had spent his life as a person of importance. He took the stand. He swore an oath to tell the truth. And he sat down. Behind him, in the cages, were men he had known for decades, associates, friends, enemies. Some stared at him with undisguised hatred. Others looked away, unable to meet his eyes. Falcone began the examination gently. He established Buscetta's background, his history, his position within Cosa Nostra, and then, methodically, he began to walk through the structure of the organization. "Tell the court," Falcone said, "about Cosa Nostra. What is it? How is it organized?" And Tommaso began to speak. For days he testified. He explained the initiation ceremony, the oath of Omertà, the hierarchy of soldiers and captains and bosses. He described the commission at Cupola, explaining how it worked, who sat on it, how decisions were made. He named names. He identified defendants in the courtroom. He explained their positions and their crimes. The testimony was devastating. For the first time, someone from the inside was explaining publicly how the Mafia worked. Tommaso described the meetings he had attended, conversations he had taken part in, decisions that had been made. He identified murder victims and named their killers. He explained how the drug trade operated, how money was cleaned, how protection rackets worked. But he also spoke about the codes, about the rules that were supposed to govern behavior, about the way Cosa Nostra was supposed to work. versus how it actually operated under the Corleonesi. He presented himself, as he had with Falcone, as someone who had tried to follow the old ways, who had been persecuted by those who had perverted the organization. These men, he said, gesturing toward some of the defendants, they're not men of honor. They murdered my sons. They killed women and children. They've destroyed everything that Cosa Nostra was supposed to represent. They're beasts, and they deserve no respect, no loyalty, no protection. The defense attorneys attacked him relentlessly. They accused him of lying to save himself, of making up testimony in exchange for leniency. They pointed to contradictions in his statements, gaps in his knowledge, times when his testimony could not be supported by independent evidence. They argued that he was a bitter man seeking revenge, that his testimony should be dismissed as the ramblings of someone who had been betrayed by his own organization. But Tommaso held firm. He admitted that he was seeking revenge, revenge for his murdered sons, revenge against the Corleonesi, who had destroyed his family. But he insisted that his testimony was true, that everything he was saying could be verified, that he was simply telling the truth about an organization that had spent a century hiding in shadows. The cross-examination lasted for days. Defense attorneys took turns, each trying to discredit him, to catch him in contradictions, to make him seem unreliable. But Tommaso had spent his life in the Mafia. He had learned to be careful with words, to think before speaking, to avoid saying anything that could be used against him. He answered their questions. He cleared up confusion, and he kept his composure even under aggressive questioning. When he finally stepped down after 2 weeks of testimony, everyone in the courtroom understood that the trial had fundamentally changed. This was not a normal prosecution, where the state tried to prove that specific individuals had committed specific crimes. This was an examination of Cosa Nostra itself, an exposure of its structure and operations, a demonstration that the Mafia was not a myth, but a real organization with identifiable members and documented crimes. After Buscetta came the other pentiti, Salvatore Cantoro, who described the violence of the Mafia war in graphic detail. Others who supported Buscetta's testimony about the organization's structure and operations. Then came civilian witnesses, survivors of violence, family members of victims, business owners who had been extorted, officials who had been corrupted. The testimony was horrifying. Witness after witness described murders, described how the Mafia controlled territory, described the atmosphere of terror that filled Sicily. They told stories of businessmen who had been killed for refusing to pay protection money, of women who had been widowed, of children who had been orphaned by Mafia violence. The defendants, for the most part, stayed silent. In Italy, defendants have the right not to testify. Most used that right. They sat behind bars, listening to testimony that implicated them in murders, drug trafficking, extortion, and countless other crimes. Some kept expressions of dignified indifference. Others looked angry, frustrated that they could not directly confront their accusers. A few seemed resigned, understanding that the evidence against them was overwhelming. The trial became a media sensation. Italian television covered it extensively. They showed footage from the courtroom. They interviewed legal experts. They discussed the implications of the testimony. For the first time, ordinary Italians were learning details about how the Mafia operated, about its structure and codes and methods. The mystery that had surrounded the organization for generations was being stripped away, replaced by documentation and evidence and testimony. Outside Sicily, the trial was also being watched closely. American law enforcement, which had been fighting La Cosa Nostra for decades, was learning from the Italian experience. The idea of prosecuting entire criminal organizations rather than just individual criminals, was gaining attention. The successes and failures of the Maxi Trial would influence how organized crime was prosecuted around the world. But inside the courtroom, the focus remained on the specifics. Prosecutor after prosecutor presented evidence. They showed financial records that demonstrated money laundering. They played wiretaps where defendants discussed criminal activities. They presented forensic evidence linking defendants to murder scenes. They called police officers and investigators who described surveillance operations and arrests. The defense fought back with every tool available. They challenged the admissibility of evidence. They argued that testimony from Pentiti should be excluded because accomplices are inherently unreliable. They claimed that their clients were being persecuted for their Sicilian heritage rather than for actual crimes. They pointed to gaps in the evidence, to times when the prosecution's case relied on inference rather than direct proof. The trial dragged on for months. The initial charges covered murders, drug trafficking, extortion, and mafia association. But as testimony continued, the prosecution added more charges. They incorporated new evidence that came out during the trial. The proceeding became a full examination of Cosa Nostra's activities over several decades. A massive documentation project as much as a legal proceeding. Security remained intense throughout. Armed guards were everywhere. They screened everyone who entered the courtroom. They watched for threats. The judges and prosecutors had bodyguards. Witnesses were protected. Even the defendants' lawyers were subject to security screening, because the mafia had shown that it would use any opportunity to strike at its enemies. The Corleonesi, even from prison or hiding, tried to intimidate participants. Lawyers received threats. Witnesses had their homes vandalized. Family members were approached and warned to convince their relatives to stop cooperating. But the state held firm. They provided protection. They refused to be intimidated. They showed that Italy was finally serious about confronting the mafia. As summer turned to fall in 1986, and fall turned to winter, the trial continued. More testimony, more evidence, more legal arguments. The proceeding had become a marathon. It tested the endurance of everyone involved. But it was also becoming clear that the prosecution was succeeding in its main goal, showing that Cosa Nostra was a real organization and that its members could be held responsible for their crimes. The Maxi Trial concluded on December 16, 1987, almost 2 years after it had begun. The verdicts, when they came, were sweeping. Of the 475 defendants, 346 were convicted. 19 received life sentences. Others received sentences ranging from a few years to decades in prison. The total prison time handed down exceeded 2,600 years. Among those receiving life sentences were Michel Greco, known as the Pope, who had served as the nominal head of the commission; Pippo Callo, the treasurer of Cosa Nostra; Giuseppe Pino Greco, no relation to Michel, a notorious hitman who had personally murdered dozens of people, and scores of others, bosses and soldiers, old men and young, all convicted of mafia association and additional crimes, including murder and drug trafficking. The absent defendants, particularly Salvatore Rina and Bernardo Provenzano, were convicted in absentia. They received life sentences for their roles in Cosa Nostra's crimes. Warrants remained active for their arrest, but they stayed underground, continuing to manage the organization from hiding. The verdicts were celebrated as a historic victory for the Italian state. For the first time, a major prosecution of the mafia had succeeded. The organization's structure had been exposed, its members identified, its leaders convicted. The myth of invincibility that had surrounded Cosa Nostra for generations had been shattered. Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino became national heroes, celebrated for their courage and their dedication to justice. They were promoted, honored, interviewed endlessly by media. But they also understood that they were marked men, that the Mafia would not forgive what they had done, that revenge was inevitable. Even if it took years to arrive, Tommaso Buscetta, whose testimony had made the prosecution possible, was moved to the United States under witness protection. The Italian government, knowing that he could never be safe in Italy, had negotiated with American authorities to place him in the U.S. Marshal's witness protection program. He would live under a new identity in an undisclosed location, guarded around the clock for the rest of his life. But even as the convictions were being celebrated, the battle was far from over. Italian law allows for multiple appeals. The defendants immediately began filing them. The verdicts would have to survive review by higher courts, a process that would take years. And there was no guarantee that the convictions would be upheld. The Mafia also began its response. Unable to kill the judges and prosecutors, immediately security was too tight. They focused on other targets. Witnesses who had testified were hunted down and murdered. Police officers who had taken part in the investigation were killed. Even lawyers who had argued too forcefully for the prosecution found themselves targeted. In 1988, a year after the verdicts, Judge Antonio Saeda and his son were murdered. Their car was forced off a mountain road in an operation that had all the signs of a mafia hit. The judge had been involved in preliminary work on the Maxi Trial. His murder was a message: cooperate with anti-mafia prosecutions and you will die. Eventually, no matter how long it takes, but the most devastating response came in 1992. On May 23rd, Judge Giovanni Falcone, along with his wife and 3 bodyguards, was killed when the Corleonesi set off a massive bomb under the highway outside Palermo. The explosion was so powerful that it created a crater in the roadway. The car carrying Falcone was destroyed. It was a spectacle of violence designed to terrorize, to show that even the most protected officials could be reached. 2 months later, on July 19th, Paolo Borsellino was killed by a car bomb outside his mother's apartment in Palermo. He had gone to visit her, traveling with his usual security detail. As he approached the building, the bomb went off. It killed him and 5 bodyguards instantly. The murder shocked Italy. Falcone and Borsellino had been national heroes, symbols of the state's determination to fight the Mafia. Their deaths seemed to show that the Mafia was still powerful, still capable of striking at its enemies, still able to terrorize Italian society despite the Maxi Trial's convictions. But the murders also backfired. The public reaction was intense. Hundreds of thousands of people took part in demonstrations against the Mafia. Politicians who had been soft on organized crime found themselves unable to defend their positions. New anti-mafia laws were passed. They gave prosecutors broader powers, and most importantly, the Italian state finally committed itself fully to the fight. They sent military forces to Sicily. They put emergency measures in place. The Supreme Court upheld most of the Maxi Trial convictions in 1992, the same year Falcone and Borsellino were murdered. The legal battle had taken 5 years, but the verdict stood. Cosa Nostra's leadership was in prison. Its structure had been exposed, and its claim to be simply a cultural attitude rather than a criminal organization had been definitively disproven. For Tommaso Buscetta, living in hiding in America, the news of Falcone's murder was devastating. Falcone had been more than just the prosecutor who had convinced him to cooperate. He had been a friend, someone who understood the complexity of Tommaso's situation, someone who treated him with respect even after he had broken Omertà. His death was personal, painful, A reminder that the violence Tommaso had tried to expose continued to claim victims. But Buscetta's cooperation had not ended with the Maxi Trial. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, he continued to testify in other trials, to provide information to investigators, to help build cases against mafiosi. He testified in the Pizza Connection trial in New York. He helped American prosecutors convict members of the Sicilian drug network. He provided information for dozens of other prosecutions in Italy and the United States. He also began to write. He worked on his memoirs, trying to explain his life and his decisions to a public that viewed him with a complex mixture of admiration, suspicion, and contempt. He gave interviews, carefully controlled and conducted under security. In them, he discussed the mafia, his decision to cooperate, his views on what Cosa Nostra had become. In these interviews, he kept his position that he had not betrayed Cosa Nostra, but had opposed those who had betrayed it first. The real traitors, he insisted, were the Corleonesi. They had murdered his sons. They had destroyed the traditional codes. They had changed the mafia from an organization with rules into a terrorist group. Whether this was genuinely what he believed or a rationalization that allowed him to live with his decision, only he could say, but it was the story he told until his death. The story he told himself about who he was and what he had done. Life in witness protection was a strange kind of imprisonment. Tommaso Buscetta was free in the sense that he was not behind bars, but he was also trapped, unable to live openly, unable to use his real name, unable to return to Sicily or Brazil or any of the places he had called home. He was a ghost, a man whose official identity had been erased, replaced by a fabrication that existed only in government databases. The U.S. Marshal Service gave him a new identity, a new name, a new birthplace, a new history. He was given documents to support this identity, a driver's license, a social security card, financial records. He was moved to an undisclosed location somewhere in America. He was placed in a house that was comfortable but anonymous. He was given a small amount of money to cover living expenses. His wife Christina and their children were with him, also under new identities, also living with the constant awareness that discovery would mean death. They were forbidden from contacting relatives, from returning to Brazil, from doing anything that might reveal their location. They were, for all practical purposes, cut off from their past lives. The isolation was deep. Tommaso had spent his entire life as someone important, someone who commanded respect, someone whose opinions mattered. Now he was nobody, a retired person living in suburban America, indistinguishable from millions of others. He could not tell his neighbors who he really was. He could not discuss his past. He had to make up ordinary explanations for his life. He was a retired businessman, perhaps, or someone who had worked in import-export before retiring. The psychological toll was huge. Tommaso suffered from depression, from nightmares about his murdered sons, from the constant awareness that he was hunted by an organization that never forgot and never forgave. He took precautions constantly, checking for surveillance, varying his routines, keeping up the cover identity that kept him alive. But he also continued to work with law enforcement. The Italian authorities would contact him through secure channels, asking him to review evidence, to identify people in photographs, to clarify details about Cosa Nostra's operations. He testified via secure video link in trials, where his presence was needed, but where physical appearance would be too dangerous. In 1992, when Falcone was murdered, Tommaso was devastated. He had lost many people over the years, sons, brothers, associates, friends, But Falcone's death affected him deeply, because Falcone had been the one who understood, who had treated him with respect, who had given him a purpose beyond simply hiding and waiting to die. He thought about coming out of hiding to attend Falcone's funeral, to pay his respects publicly, but the security risks were too great. The U.S. Marshals firmly said no instead. He mourned privately, in the anonymous house in the undisclosed location. Another man destroyed by Cosa Nostra added to the long list of victims. Borsellino's murder 2 months later deepened his despair. It seemed that everything he had risked, everything he had sacrificed, had accomplished nothing. The Mafia was still killing, still terrorizing, still powerful despite the Maxi Trial's convictions. His cooperation had made him a traitor in the eyes of Cosa Nostra, but had not actually destroyed the organization. But he continued. What else could he do? He was too old to start over completely, too marked to ever escape his past. His only option was to keep cooperating, to keep providing information, to try to make sure that some good came from the destruction of his family and his life. In the mid-1990s, he worked on his autobiography. He collaborated with Italian journalist Enzo Biaggi to tell his story. The book, titled La Mafia ha vinto, The Mafia Has Won, was published in 1999. It became a bestseller in Italy. In it, Tommaso described his life, his decision to cooperate, his views on the Mafia and Italian society. The title reflected his pessimism about whether his cooperation had achieved its goals. Despite the Maxi Trial, despite the arrests and convictions, the Mafia remained powerful. Rina had been captured in 1993, but Provenzano remained free. He was still managing Cosa Nostra from hiding. New bosses had risen to replace those imprisoned. The drug trade continued. The violence continued. I thought I could destroy them, Tommaso wrote. I thought that by breaking Omertà, by explaining how they operated, I could help the state eliminate the Mafia. But I was naive. The Mafia is not just an organization. It's a culture, a way of thinking, a disease that infects Sicilian society. You can arrest bosses, you can convict soldiers, but as long as the culture remains, the Mafia will regenerate. The book drew intense interest. Italians read it to understand the Mafia from the inside, to hear from someone who had been part of the organization at its highest levels. Critics debated whether Tommaso was a hero or a traitor, whether his cooperation had been motivated by noble principles or by self-interest. Some praised his courage in breaking Omertà. Others condemned him as an infame who had betrayed sacred oaths. Tommaso himself seemed uncertain about his legacy. In interviews conducted under strict security conditions, he expressed no regret about cooperating. But he acknowledged that he was haunted by what he had done. He maintained that he had not betrayed Cosa Nostra, but had opposed those who had betrayed it first. But he also acknowledged that, in the eyes of most mafiosi, he was a traitor, someone who had violated the most sacred rule. I did what I had to do, he said in one interview. They murdered my sons. They destroyed my family. They violated every code that Cosa Nostra was supposed to uphold. If I'm a traitor for seeking justice for my children, then I accept that label. But the real traitors are those who killed innocents, who murdered women and children, who turned the Mafia into a terrorist organization. His health began to decline in the late 1990s. He was diagnosed with cancer. Despite treatment, the disease progressed. He faced his death with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life. He refused to complain. He kept his dignity even as his body failed. In his final months, he thought about his life, the choices he had made, the people he had lost, the legacy he would leave. He thought about his sons. about what they might have become if they had lived. He thought about Sicily, about whether he would ever see it again before he died. He thought about the Mafia, about whether his cooperation had made any difference at all. "I lived as a mafioso for 40 years, he told a visitor near the end. "I made my choices and I don't ask for forgiveness, but I also tried to make things right. Tried to stop the people who had destroyed everything the Mafia was supposed to represent. Whether that redeems me or damns me, I leave to others to judge." Tommaso Buscetta died on April 4th, 2000. He was in a hospital in the United States. He was 71 years old. The official announcement of his death was brief and vague. It gave no details about his location or the circumstances of his death. Even in death, he remained under protection. His final resting place was kept secret to prevent destruction of his grave by Mafia loyalists. The news of his death made headlines in Italy. He had been one of the most famous or infamous Italians of the late 20th century, a man who had lived multiple lives and whose choices had helped reshape Italian society. The reactions to his death reflected the complexity of his legacy. Anti-mafia activists mourned him as a hero, someone who had risked everything to fight Cosa Nostra. They praised his courage in breaking Omertà, his willingness to testify despite the risks, his contribution to the Maxi Trial that had exposed the mafia structure. They argued that without Buscetta, the Italian state would never have found the courage to truly confront organized crime. Many ordinary Italians had mixed feelings. They appreciated what he had done to fight the mafia, but they also understood that he had been a criminal, a drug trafficker who had made millions of dollars destroying lives. His cooperation did not erase his crimes, did not bring back the people who had died from the heroin he had helped sell. He was both hero and villain. Which label applied depended on which aspect of his life you emphasized. Within Cosa Nostra, his death was celebrated. He was an infame, a traitor who had violated Omertà. His death, even from natural causes, was seen as justice. Some bosses reportedly toasted his death, celebrating that the man who had caused them so much damage was finally gone. But privately, even some mafiosi admitted a grudging respect for what he had done. He had sought revenge for his murdered sons, and he had achieved it. The Corleonesi had destroyed his family. He had responded by helping to imprison their leadership. It was, in a strange way, very Sicilian, a vendetta carried out not with guns, but with words. Not through violence, but through the legal system. Historians and criminologists immediately began assessing his impact. The Maxi Trial, made possible by his testimony, had been a turning point in Italian history. It had shown that the Mafia could be prosecuted as an organization, that Omertà could be broken, that the state could fight back effectively. The legal framework established during the trial had been used in dozens of subsequent prosecutions. It had led to thousands of additional convictions. But had it actually weakened the Mafia? This was the harder question. Cosa Nostra had certainly been damaged. Its leadership was in prison. Its structure had been exposed. Its mystery had been shattered, but it had not been destroyed. The organization adapted. It became more careful. It developed new methods of communication and operation. The drug trade continued. The extortion continued. The corruption continued. Some analysts argued that Buscetta's cooperation had actually made the Mafia stronger. By forcing it to evolve, the old Mafia, the one Buscetta had known, with its traditional codes and its visible presence, had been replaced by something more sophisticated, more subtle, more difficult to detect and prosecute. The organization had learned from its mistakes. It had become more corporate, more focused on infiltrating legitimate business and politics. rather than engaging in spectacular violence. Others argued that this was still progress, a mafia that operated in shadows, that avoided violence, that tried to keep a low profile, that was less damaging to society than one that murdered judges and set off car bombs. The Corleoneses' reign of terror had ended, and while Cosa Nostra remained, it was diminished, less powerful, less capable of terrorizing an entire region. The debate over Buscetta's legacy extended to questions of redemption. Had his cooperation redeemed him? Could someone who had spent 40 years as a criminal, who had helped import tons of heroin, who had ordered murders, find redemption by cooperating with authorities? The Catholic Church, which had long had a complicated relationship with the mafia, offered no clear answer. Some priests argued that true repentance could redeem anyone, that Buscetta's willingness to fight the mafia in his final years showed genuine remorse. Others insisted that redemption required genuine regret for all sins, not just selective cooperation motivated by revenge. Buscetta himself had been unclear on this point. He never claimed to be redeemed. He insisted he had done what was necessary, what was right given the circumstances, what any man of honor would have done when faced with the betrayal he had experienced. But he did not present himself as a reformed criminal seeking forgiveness. He was a warrior who had changed sides in a war, not a penitent seeking absolution. His family, scattered across the world under various levels of protection, had their own complicated relationship with his legacy. His surviving children carried his name, or at least knew their real name, even if they could not use it publicly. They had lost siblings, had been forced into exile, had lived under the shadow of their father's choices their entire lives. Some were proud of what he had done. Others were angry at the choices that had destroyed their family. Most felt some combination of both in Sicily. Attitudes toward Buscetta evolved over time. In the immediate aftermath of the Maxi Trial, he was universally hated, not just by mafiosi, but by many ordinary Sicilians who saw cooperation with authorities as a violation of cultural values that went beyond the mafia. But as years passed and new generations came of age, views shifted. Younger Sicilians who had grown up in a Sicily where the state actually fought the mafia, where Omertà was challenged rather than celebrated, saw Buscetta differently. Not as a traitor, but as someone who had helped break the mafia's grip on their island. The cultural impact of his story was huge. He became a character in movies, television shows, books, documentaries. His life was dramatized, analyzed, turned into myth. He became a symbol of betrayal to some, of courage to others, of the moral complexity of fighting evil by becoming an informant. The questions his life raised remained relevant decades after his death. When is it acceptable to break an oath? What do you owe to an organization that has betrayed its own principles? Can cooperation with authorities be honorable, or is it always betrayal? How do you balance loyalty to family against loyalty to abstract principles? Can someone who has done evil later do good? And if so, does that good redeem the evil? These were not questions with easy answers, and Buscetta's life did not provide them. What it provided was a case study in moral complexity, a reminder that people and situations rarely fit into neat categories of good and evil, hero and villain, traitor and patriot. Tommaso Buscetta's death in 2000 did not end his impact on the war against the mafia. In fact, his most important legacy was not the convictions he helped secure, not even the breaking of Omertà, but rather the framework he established for future cooperation. He had shown that high-ranking mafiosi could be convinced to testify, that their testimony could stand up in court, that such cooperation could lead to successful prosecutions after Buscetta. The pentiti became a standard tool in anti-mafia investigations. In the years following his death, hundreds of additional mafiosi followed his path. They chose cooperation over silence. Some were motivated by revenge, as Buscetta had been. Others were pragmatists who understood that the mafia's code of loyalty was one-sided, that the organization would sacrifice them without hesitation if it served its purposes. Still others were simply tired, worn down by lives of constant violence and paranoia, seeking a way out, even if it meant betrayal. The Italian state developed careful protocols for managing pentiti, protecting them and their families, verifying their testimony, using their information to build prosecutable cases. Specialized prosecutors and investigators became experts at extracting information, at distinguishing truth from self-serving fiction, at supporting testimony with independent evidence. Salvatore Riina, the Corleonesi boss, who had ordered the murder of Buscetta's sons, was captured in 1993. His arrest was partly the result of information provided by pentiti, who had learned from Buscetta's example. Riina was convicted of dozens of murders, including the killings of Falcone in Borsellino. He was sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 2017. He never expressed regret for his crimes. Bernardo Provenzano, the other leader of the Corleonesi, remained free until 2006. He was finally captured after decades in hiding. Like Riina, he was convicted of numerous murders. He died in prison in 2016. The capture of both men and the dismantling of the Corleonesi leadership was directly connected to the prosecutorial model that Buscetta's cooperation had established. But the mafia itself did not die. Cosa Nostra adapted. As criminal organizations always do, it became less visible, more sophisticated in its operations, more focused on infiltrating legitimate business and politics rather than engaging in spectacular violence. The younger generation of mafiosi learned from the mistakes of their predecessors. They understood that attracting attention through violence was counterproductive. Other criminal organizations learned from Cosa Nostra's experience as well. The 'Ndrangheta, based in Calabria, became more powerful than the Sicilian Mafia, in part because they kept stronger codes of silence. They were more resistant to infiltration by pentiti. They studied what had happened to Cosa Nostra and put in place countermeasures. Stricter checking of members, compartmentalized operations, policies that reduced the damage any single informant could cause. The debates about Buscetta's legacy continued in academic circles, in political discussions, in cultural representations. Was he a hero who had helped the Italian state finally confront organized crime? Or was he a criminal seeking revenge, whose cooperation happened to serve public purposes, but was motivated by private grievances? The answer, unsatisfyingly, was probably both. What cannot be denied is the scale of his impact. The Maxi Trial changed Italian society's understanding of the mafia. It showed conclusively that it was a real organization with structure and hierarchy, rather than simply a cultural attitude or a collection of independent criminals. The legal framework established during that trial became the basis for decades of subsequent prosecutions, and the precedent of high-level cooperation that Buscetta established made it possible to penetrate and prosecute criminal organizations in ways that had previously been impossible. In American law enforcement, Buscetta's cooperation in the Pizza Connection trial and other cases helped prosecutors understand the international dimensions of drug trafficking. His testimony showed connections between Sicilian and American criminal organizations. It revealed how heroin moved from source countries through Sicily to the United States. This understanding guided subsequent investigations and prosecutions of international organized crime. But perhaps his most important legacy was psychological rather than legal. He showed that Omertà, the supposedly unbreakable code of silence, could in fact be broken. He showed that even high-ranking mafiosi men, who had sworn sacred oaths and built their identities around being men of honor, could choose cooperation when circumstances demanded it. This knowledge changed the calculation for both mafiosi and law enforcement. For mafiosi, the existence of pentiti introduced a permanent element of doubt and suspicion. Anyone could potentially become an informant. Trust, which had always been difficult in an organization built on violence and intimidation, became nearly impossible. The fear of betrayal became as powerful a constraint as any code or oath. For law enforcement, the possibility of cooperation gave leverage in interrogations and prosecutions. Investigators could point to Buscetta's example, could suggest that cooperation was possible, could offer paths toward redemption, or at least toward reduced sentences and protection for family members. The pentiti program became a weapon in the state's arsenal, one that proved remarkably effective over the decades. The moral questions that Buscetta's life raised remained unresolved. Italian society continued to debate whether informants were heroes or traitors, whether cooperation with authorities could ever be honorable for someone who had sworn sacred oaths, whether the ends justified the means. These debates reflected deeper questions about loyalty, honor, justice, and the relationship between individuals and the organizations they serve. In Sicily, where the mafia's cultural influence ran deepest, attitudes continued to evolve. The younger generation raised in a Sicily where the state actively fought organized crime, where judges and police officers were celebrated as heroes rather than viewed as enemies, developed different perspectives. To them, Buscetta was not necessarily a traitor, but someone who had made a difficult choice in impossible circumstances, someone whose cooperation had helped create the Sicily they lived in, safer, more prosperous, less dominated by criminal organizations. But in the traditional communities, in the neighborhoods where the old code still held sway, Buscetta remained an infame, someone who had violated sacred principles. These communities kept their suspicion of state authority, their belief in handling problems privately rather than involving outsiders, their conviction that certain oaths could never be broken without dishonor. The divided opinion reflected Sicily's divided soul, caught between traditional codes and modern values, between old loyalties and new opportunities, between a past dominated by the mafia and a future where the state's authority might finally be accepted as legitimate. What ultimately are we to make of Tommaso Buscetta? How do we judge a life so complex, so contradictory, so filled with both terrible crimes and courageous decisions? Perhaps judgment is not the point. Perhaps what his story offers is not a moral lesson, but an examination of how people make impossible choices, how they rationalize their decisions, how they live with the consequences of their actions. Tommaso Buscetta was born into poverty in a place and time where legitimate opportunities were scarce. He joined the mafia not because he was evil, but because it offered what he desperately wanted: respect, power, prosperity, belonging. He swore sacred oaths. For decades, he believed in what he had sworn to uphold. He built an empire, made millions of dollars, lived well, and probably thought of himself as a man of honor who followed the codes. Then the organization he had devoted his life to turned on him, murdered his children, destroyed his family, and in that moment of crisis, he made a choice that redefined his life. He chose revenge over loyalty, cooperation over silence, the state over the organization. It was a choice born from grief and rage, rationalized as defense of traditional values, executed with calculation and intelligence. Did that choice redeem him? The answer depends on what redemption means He helped imprison hundreds of mafiosi, many of them responsible for terrible crimes. He exposed the structure of Cosa Nostra. He made it possible for the state to fight organized crime more effectively. He showed that Omertà could be broken. He encouraged others to follow his example. These were real achievements that served public purposes. But he had also spent 40 years as a criminal. He had helped import tons of heroin into the United States. He had destroyed countless lives. He had ordered murders, intimidated witnesses, corrupted officials. His cooperation did not undo those crimes, did not bring back the people who had died because of his actions. And his motivation for cooperating was not selfless. It was revenge, pure and simple. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Tommaso Buscetta was a criminal who, when personally wronged by his own organization, decided to burn it down. His cooperation served the public good, but that was almost accidental. He was pursuing private revenge that happened to match public purposes. He was neither hero nor villain, but something more human and complicated. A man who made terrible choices, suffered terrible consequences, and responded by making different terrible choices that happened to serve useful ends. His life raises questions that extend beyond organized crime. What loyalty do we owe to organizations that betray their own principles? When is it acceptable to break oaths that we have sworn? How do we balance personal grievances against abstract principles? Can cooperation with authority ever be honorable for someone who has defined himself in opposition to that authority? These questions do not have universal answers. They depend on context, on circumstances, on the specific situation each person faces. Buscetta's answers were his own, shaped by his background, his experiences, his relationships, his losses. They might not be the answers others would give, but they were true to his situation. What we can say with certainty is that his choices mattered. The Maxi Trial changed Italy. It showed that the Mafia could be fought. It established legal and procedural frameworks that have been used in thousands of prosecutions. Without Buscetta's testimony, that trial would not have been possible. Without that trial, Italy's relationship with organized crime would be fundamentally different today. We can also say that he paid a terrible price for his choices. He lost his sons, his family, his identity, his home. He spent the last 16 years of his life in hiding, hunted by the organization he had once served. Unable to live openly or use his real name, he died far from Sicily, from the narrow streets of Palermo, where he had been born and had first learned what it meant to be a man of honor. Was it worth it? Only he could answer that question, and he never gave a clear answer in his writings and interviews. He expressed no regret about cooperating, but he also acknowledged the huge cost. He maintained that he had done what was necessary, what any man would have done in his circumstances, what honor demanded, despite appearing to violate honor's most sacred principle. Perhaps that contradiction honor achieved through betrayal, loyalty expressed through cooperation, tradition defended by breaking tradition, is the most honest summary of his life. He was a man caught between two worlds, two codes, two definitions of what it meant to be honorable, trying to navigate impossible choices with no good options in the end. Tommaso Buscetta was neither the hero that anti-mafia activists wanted him to be, nor the traitor that mafiosi labeled him. He was a man who lived a complicated life, made difficult choices, and left behind a legacy that continues to shape Italian society and international efforts against organized crime. His story reminds us that people are complex, that moral questions rarely have simple answers, that the line between right and wrong is often blurry, that understanding human behavior requires accepting contradiction and ambiguity, rather than forcing everything into neat categories. He was the boss of two worlds, not just Sicily and America, but also the world of crime and the world of cooperation with justice, the world of Omertà and the world of testimony, the world of traditional codes and the world of modern law enforcement. He lived in the space between those worlds, never fully belonging to either, always caught between competing loyalties and conflicting values. And perhaps that is the most fitting tribute for Tommaso Buscetta, a man of two worlds who tried to bridge the gap between them, and in doing so, changed both forever. And that's the story of Tommaso Buscetta, the man who broke the mafia's code of silence and paid for it with everything he loved. His testimony sent hundreds to prison, but it cost him his sons, his brothers, his homeland, and his identity. History hasn't decided if he was a hero or a villain. Maybe he was both. What do you think? Was Buscetta right to break Omertà? Could you have done what he did? Let me know in the comments below. If you made it this far, you're a real one. Drop a fire in the comments. Don't forget to like this video. Subscribe for more deep dives into true crime and gangster history. And hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. I've got more incredible tailies coming your way. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, some secrets are paid for in blood,